Make France great again. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 1, Jerome Bonaparte in Faithful London. April 22nd, 1848 at 8 am a clipper ship full of cargo and passengers departed from Calais and crossed the English Channel, breaking through the white fog scattered on the sea level and arriving in the waters near the London dockyard in the early morning. Point on the watchtower of the dock, the signalman responsible for reporting the entry of ships into the port gave a signal to the moving ships to allow entry and reported the news of the arrival of ships to the personnel below the observation deck. The London dockyard, which had been silent all night, welcomed it. First order of the day: you pigs and trash. If you don't want to be unemployed like other wharves, hurry up for me. At the pier on the shore, the dockers, dressed in shabby and dusty clothes, gathered their tired bodies, who had just transported and sorted the goods, but had no time to rest for a while, and boarded the prepared boats. Although their faces were filled with numbness, their bodies moved involuntarily. Point jobs were not easy to find in the 19th century, let alone these special times. If there is a slight error, the only thing waiting for them is unreasonable layoffs. Layoffs are a slow death for a dock worker who has seen corpses drifting down the Thames in the days since the economic crisis. The roommates who were laughing and laughing together the day before may become a member of the homeless army the next day because they are unemployed and unable to pay the rent. Point not to mention them. Even those gentlemen who are well dressed on weekdays face the risk of unemployment and even death all the time. These days, they have seen countless corpses floating on the Thames, wearing black jackets with their heads turned to the water and their backs to the sky. Listening to them, these people are those who like to opportunistically on weekdays. It must not be the purest wish of every dock worker to be fired. Point under the guidance of the observation deck, the small boats docked on both sides of the London dock slowly entered the narrow distribution channel. The sails were put up one after another, and the boat continued to travel a certain distance with the help of the remaining strength, until the thick iron anchor sank completely under the water. Several small boats gradually approached the cargo ship sailboat, and the wooden incline fell ladder from the sailboat to the small boat. Under the command of the sailors, the passengers on the ply would slide from the inclined ladder to the dinghy, and then take the dinghy to the shore. The passengers left the ship one by one and boarded the dinghy until the last young man. Point at this time, he smiled and shook hands with the sailors who surrounded him. In turn. Point the sailors who were held by the young people were very excited and they kept chanting words such as "Long live the Emperor" and "Long live the Empire." Cough, cough. A crisp cough came from behind the sailors. Almost all the sailors knew that the owner of the voice was the captain of the ship, and then came the rough voice of the first mate. You have to surround the guests. When? Have you all forgotten your own jobs? Why don't you go to work? The sailors who originally surrounded the young man scattered when they heard Defuku's rough voice, and many sailors had regretful expressions on their faces. The captain and first mate came to the young man and opened their mouths respectfully and said, "I'm very sorry for what happened just now, Your Royal Highness." The young man, who was called the prince by the captain, looked only 23 or 4 years old, with a slender body, a flowing golden head swaying in the wind under the sea breeze, and his face with black pupils and sharp corners resembled that person. "Sir." The young man stretched out his hand with a smile and said sincerely, "The empire has long ceased to exist for many years, and I'm no longer a prince. I prefer you to call me Napoleon Jerome Bonaparte, His Royal Highness." The captain held little Jerome's hand like a child seeing a new toy. "Oh no. Forgive me for calling you Jerome. My father was originally a member of the Imperial Guard. Second, grew up listening to the Emperor's stories as a child." The captain told little Jerome about how his father became a member of the Emperor's army, went through Leipzig with the Emperor, and was forced to retire after the war because of an injury to his right foot. "When I learned that you were on the ship, I really didn't know how to face you. My father always taught me." The captain chattered like a flood with a tap turned on, talking about their family's history of fighting for the emperor. Jerome listened to the captain's words quietly, nodding from time to time. The captain's incessant words continued for nearly half an hour, until the first mate who was standing by the side lightly touched his body with his elbow. The captain, who reacted quickly, apologized to Jerome. Jerome nodded and said, "Thank you for everything you have done for the Empire. The Bonaparte family will not forget his supporters." After speaking, Jerome took out the pocket watch from his jacket pocket. It was already 9:15. "There are less than 2 hours left until the meeting. I'm sorry. Please allow me to excuse me. I will meet with my cousin. It's not what a gentleman should do to rush to make an appointment," Jerome said apologetically in his tone. No, I was abrupt." The captain also apologized. Under the watchful eye of the captain, first mate and the whole crew, Jerome Bonaparte left the sailboat and jumped into the dinghy leading to the London pier. Sitting at the stern of the boat, little Jerome looked at the countless boats going back and forth on both sides of the river, with a hint of confusion in his eyes. It has been nearly 4 months since he traveled to the present, and there is still a layer of estrangement between him and this world. Everything in front of me seems to be so illusory, but it really exists. The water in the Thames is many times dirtier than in the 21st century, and there is an indescribable pungent smell in the air. It's time to let those who advocate fresh air come here to take a look. The pure and fresh air of the 19th century. Little Jerome silently complained in his heart. The boat continued to move forward, and the pungent smell became stronger and stronger. Sitting on the boat and looking far into the distance, you can see rows of towering chimneys emitting white smoke in the distance. This kind of smoke is the sulfur dioxide after burning coal. If it is the 21st century, such emissions will only attract the attention of environmental protection workers, and rectification and shutdown are just around the corner. In the 19th century, it was a symbol of the power of an empire. The giant beast called industry is spreading its fierce fangs in an attempt to devour the whole world. Notes. 1. Napoleon. Jerome Bonaparte, September 9, 1822 to March 17, 1891, the son of Jerome Bonaparte, Napoleon's nephew. Chapter 2, Count Fisher de Pesily. Countless boats and rowboats are used on the narrow inland river, and the boats move forward slowly. Almost every dinghy carried a gentleman in a Rococo period flak dress, note 1, and stockings on his lower body. In the middle is a lady wearing a sun hat and a long laced dress. Playing the Thames is a compulsory course for every British gentleman and lady. Even though the water in the Thames was already turbid and stenched, they were still able to talk about the future without changing their faces, and our protagonist, little Jerome, obviously didn't have the mind to swim in the mountains and waters. Standing on the bow of the boat, he kept looking around the shore with his toes on his toes. Under the superb skills of the sailors, the boat did not collide in the inland river, and gradually approached a small port in the London dockyard. Little Jerome also seemed to have found something on the shore. Little Jerome, who had not waited for the dinghy to dock completely, picked up his luggage and jumped from the dinghy to the shore. Under the amazed eyes of the sailors, little Jerome smiled and thanked, "Thank you for your help during this journey. By the way, say hello to the captain for me." After speaking, little Jerome turned around and disappeared into the crowd. What? An approachable prince, unlike those guys in Paris. I can't wait to turn my nostrils up all day. That's right. If he is elected president, I will definitely vote for him. The prince is elected president? I don't think the authorities will agree to it. Who knows? The sailors gate docked on the dinghy, waiting. Thank you. IU has the style of a keyboard politician of later generations. Too bad they don't have a keyboard in their hands. Passing through the crowded dockyard, Jerome finally came to a small town near the London dockyard, where he met the person he met. "Pesily, I'm so glad we can meet again," little Jerome said, after giving the middle-aged man a warm hug with a smile. Count Fisher de Pesily, of course. The identity of the Earl was claimed by Pesily, and little Jerome had reason to suspect that Pesily's Earl's identity might be fake, or that it was an Earl in the Italian region. Who does not know that in the whole of Europe, under the leadership of the Holy Pope and the kings of various states in Italy, the titles in Italy have depreciated at a speed visible to the naked eye. In Italy, you only need to occupy any island, or even a piece of land in the void, and then hand over a certain amount of money to the Pope or the king of the country, and you can be canonized as a noble, just like the protagonist in the Count of Monte Cristo. Today, not only Italy, but also the aristocracy and the entire European region is depreciating at a speed visible to the naked eye. In France under the rule of the Orleans dynasty, there have been cases of wealthy people being canonized as viscounts in the 18th century. This was unimaginable. Capital was eroding the ancient aristocratic system at an unparalleled speed. The glory of the aristocracy gradually became lonely after the war of his uncle. Closer to home, although Pessy's status as an earl is subject to negotiation, he remains loyal to his cousin, Charles Bonaparte, as a speculator. For a full 13 years from 1835 to the present, the Bohemian journalist, also self-proclaimed, contributed to the French Occidental magazine, which stopped after only one issue, is still not a match for the energy of agent his cousin make all kinds of big news in France. The Strasbourg riot in 1840 was the masterpiece of the Count in front of him. Note to His Royal Highness Jerome, we are also very happy to see you again. But, Perrin's expression showed a hint of doubt. If his memory is correct, the last time he met the prince was probably more than a year ago. The little Prince Jerome a year ago was definitely not as thin and strong as he is now. A year ago, the prince was like a child weighing more than 300 pounds. He was so tired that he was out of breath after just 2 steps. Well, little Jerome explained, after thinking for a moment, a lot of things happened in the middle, which made me determined to lose weight. Perrin showed a clear and wretched expression. Although French women say they have unique tastes, there are few women who are obsessed with fat. Perrin also had to admit that, to a certain extent, the thin little Jerome was more suitable as a Bonapartist advocate than Prince Louis, Napoleon Louis. Little Jerome did not know Perrin's inner thoughts, but this did not prevent him from guessing that Percy must have arranged him in his mind. Percy, the gentleman standing by the side, is the new recruit from my cousin. Little Jerome's voice reached Percy's ear after recovering. Percy hurriedly introduced to Jerome, Your Highness, this is Colonel Fleury, who used to serve in the French Foreign Legion. Little Jerome then carefully looked at the sturdy man in front of him. The sharp-edged face revealed the iron blood and murderous aura of a soldier. This is the momentum that can only be felt on the body of a veteran. It is slightly curved. The index finger can see obvious calluses. French Foreign Legion. Very good. Little Jerome nodded with satisfaction and stepped forward to hold Fleury's hand and said, the Bonaparte family needs people like you. It's my honor to be able to serve the emperor. Colonel Fleury. Jerome also claimed to be self-proclaimed, if he guessed correctly, or was canonized randomly by his cousin, meticulously responded to Little Jerome. Little Jerome let go of Fleury's hand and patted Fleury on the shoulder as a sign of encouragement. Then he turned to look at Percy and asked half jokingly, Percy, where is Our Majesty now? Does he not want to see my cousin anymore? His Royal Highness, His Majesty, he. Percy drooped his head, looking a little depressed. P.S. 1. Rococo period, an art style and art form that originated in France in the 18th century and spread throughout Europe. Flak dress, a product of the Rococo period, after the edification of the 18th century and the Industrial Revolution, unnecessary decoration was removed, and its appearance is closer to the tuxedo of later generations. Keely in a shirt too. Strasbourg Rebellion refers to the 1840 Napoleon III, encouraged by Percy, who smuggled into France despite the ban of the July dynasty, and the Boulogne recruiting regiment launched a counter-offensive against the July dynasty. The hilarious coup d'etat lasted a few hours and ended with the arrest of Napoleon III. Napoleon III was imprisoned in Strasbourg prison until he escaped in 1846. Chapter 3, Louis Napoleon critically ill. Percy, tell me what happened? Cousin, what happened to him? Percy's expression caused Little Jerome's originally calm heart to waver, and his smiling face gradually turned into a dignified expression. His drooping hands unknowingly caressed his brown-yellow cowhide trousers, and he kept thinking about his past life in his mind. Data of point forgot to mention, the Little Jerome in the previous life was a senior European history lover. He was proficient in the history after the Great Revolution data, and then forced to cross. For 4 months, Little Jerome did not dare to do anything out of the ordinary. He was afraid that this little butterfly would flap his wings and blow his cousin's throne away, which would be laughable. As long as the cousin becomes the emperor of the empire, he can become a real prince by himself. As for the loss of the throne and the future Franco-Prussian War, little Jerome wouldn't let it happen at all. No, my cousin shouldn't be in trouble at this time. Little Jerome clearly remembers his previous life data. His cousin returned to Paris in April, was then kicked out of the country, and returned to Paris again in July, to run for the presidency. The historical line of Louis Bonaparte had a smooth journey to the presidency. Unexpectedly, to be on guard against my own butterfly wings, I still fanned from Paris to London. Your Majesty, he Pesily lowered his head and sighed, hesitatingly said, he has cholera, I'm afraid. The word cholera hit Jerome's heart like two heavy hammers, and an indescribable emptiness poured into Jerome's heart, followed by a brief heart palpitation. This feeling comes from the soul acting on Jerome's body, causing his body to lean back slightly. His knees seem to be pulled out of strength, and he falls to the ground. Fortunately, Fleury quickly supported Jerome, so Jerome would not lose face. Jerome, who was supported by Fleury, roared word by word, Mr. Persily, you promised me to take care of him dutifully. What the asterisk is going on? Why did he get infected with my cousin? Cholera, in the 19th century, when there were no antibiotics, no penicillin, and even medicine was transformed from disorganized to systematic, the most common and deadly thing was cholera. If you have cholera, you have to shed a layer of skin, even if you don't die. Feeling Jerome's anger, Pesily responded cautiously, Your Majesty, he may have contracted it when Britain was acting as a vigilante. Some time ago, Britain was prevalent in that strange disease. Note 1 Vigilante? A head of the Bonaparte family, a prince to become a vigilante? Jerome pointed at Pesily with an angry smile and scolded, What the asterisk are you doing? Aunt Hortense, father, sister and others, the entire Bonaparte family entrusted you with the leader of the Bonaparte family, and you didn't do anything. If you hadn't instigated your cousin, he wouldn't have gone down this road. The resentment hidden in the depths of the soul was vented through Jerome's mouth, and Pesily could only submissively express that he had not fulfilled his role as a servant. After some asterisk abuse, Jerome asked again, Where is my cousin now, King? St. James Street, take care of Miss Howard. Pesily, who was sullen, after being reprimanded by Jerome, quickly responded, Why don't you put Jerome, who wanted to reprimand Pesily for not sending his cousin to the hospital, suddenly remembered. In the 19th century, when medical facilities were not perfect, public hospitals and even some private hospitals were not as good as at home. Most doctors in public hospitals were part-time doctors. Earthworkers earned tips, the operating table full of flies, the gore stained with oil, and the unsterilized scalpel, each of which seems to be a challenge from God to 19th century gentlemen. Compared with dirty hospitals, staying at home is a good choice. Of course, these situations are only for the rich, and the workers without money can only enjoy the treatment of the crappy doctors from the street charity hospital. Jerome Bonaparte shouted to Pesily and Fleury, Let's go. Under the guidance of Fleury, Jerome Bonaparte came to a dark black carriage with a striking Bonaparte logo printed on the side box of the carriage. Obviously, this carriage is not a temporary lease, but is used by my cousin for daily communication. It costs about 2,400 francs to get a good carriage, and about 4,000 francs a year, after adding fodder and other miscellaneous items. Jerome decided that his cousin might have used new debts to pay off old debts, and used his father's estate as collateral. Jerome opened the car door and got into the carriage of the carriage. Pesily followed closely. Fleury sat in the driver's seat of the carriage, restraining the horse's head with one hand and waving the whip with the other. Sit tight. The carriage began to move under Fleury's skillful technique. Jerome on the carriage closed his eyes and thought about the next road. Pesily, who was sitting opposite Jerome, looked around anxiously and glanced at Jerome from time to time. The carriage rushed left and right under Fleury's driving and soon left the slums of East London, crossed Waterloo Bridge, and continued to move forward. The dividing line of two worlds, Shaftesbury Street / St. Martin's Church, close at hand. Behind the carriage was a low, dilapidated three-story building, while in front of the carriage was a row of small apartments looking to the left in the direction of St. Martin's Church. You can even see the towering spire of Buckingham Palace Point. A church and an iron bridge separate poverty from wealth point. After entering Shaftesbury Street, the surrounding police force increased significantly. Every 10 meters on the street, vigilantes in tattered uniforms and holding revolvers could be seen patrolling point. Even the shops became clean and tidy, and the hustle and bustle of the slums also disappeared. The well-dressed gentlemen also nodded to each other. In order to prevent a collision, Fleury slowed down his horse and walked through the streets of Shaftesbury and stopped at a small mansion at the end of King St. James Street. "Your Highness, here we are." Pessela's voice reached Jerome's ear. Jerome slowly opened his eyes. PS 1. After escaping from Strasbourg to London, Louis Bonaparte voluntarily served as a vigilante in the London area with his own dry food and suppressed the workers' charter movement brewing in Britain in April. Chapter 4. Tragic fraternity meeting. The people inside the mansion seemed to hear the carriage outside the mansion. After a while, a middle-aged man wearing a black flack coat with a white brooch hanging on his chest appeared outside the mansion and slightly to Fleury, who was sitting in the driver's seat. Fleury quickly got out of the driver's seat. He handed the reins of the horse's head to the middle-aged man, and Pessely and the carriage got up first to open the door and lowered the stairs. Jerome got up and glanced at Pessely, who was at the bottom of the stairs, and slowly got out of the car. His eyes turned to the middle-aged man holding the horse's head, and his solemn expression forced a smile. "Tylan, long time no see," Jerome said in a dry London accent. The middle-aged man named Tylan also responded with a smile on his face. "His Royal Highness, long time no see." Although he had already learned about his cousin's situation from Pessely's mouth, Jerome couldn't help but want to ask this servant who had followed his cousin for more than 10 years, who was loyal and meticulous in his work. What if it was all just a prank by Pessely and his cousin? With a faint hope, Jerome asked, "Cousin, how is he? How is the situation now?" After Tylan was silent for a few seconds, he hesitantly responded, "Your Majesty, the situation is not optimistic. The body has been feverish, and he is always vomiting. In short, Your Highness, you will know when you go in and take a look." After all, Tyran led the carriage away. He really didn't want to pass on his sadness to Jerome, who had not yet entered the mansion. After listening to Tylan's response, Jerome felt another colic in his heart. This pain from the depths of the soul is probably the legacy left by the previous owner of the body. Standing beside Jerome, Pessely looked at Jerome with a bloodless face, pointed to the small mansion and said, "His Royal Highness, Your Majesty is waiting for you in the mansion." Recovering, Jerome walked to the door of the mansion in 3 steps. Looking at the door of the mansion washed with brown paint in front of him, Jerome didn't have the courage to open the door. Pessely, who was beside him, stretched out his hand and gently pushed the door open. The living room on the first floor appeared in Jerome's eyes. The layout of the living room was roughly the product of the fusion of the Empire period and the Rococo period. The luxurious exterior inadvertently revealed the momentum of an Avo-Riche. The red drapery hanging by the window was hooked on the left and right sides of the window with bronze hooks, and the sun was obscured by the smog of industrialization. The sunlight shone on the fading red Turkish wool blanket, clinging to the copper-plated railings of the stairs on the first and second floors of the walls. Are also dazzling in the sunlight. This is an exquisite product for more than 30 years. It has been maintained by the exquisite owner for more than 30 years. Time has not left a scratch on this exquisite product, but it is also like Napoleon's brilliant glory. More than 30 years ago, the fusion product of the imperial regime and the Rococo period was destined to fail to adapt to today's rapidly developing industrialized society. More and more upstarts squeezed into the upper class will determine the direction of the entire era with their strong assets. The extravagance advocated by the aristocracy is no longer, and pristine will be popular for a long time. While observing the layout of the mansion, Jerome followed Pessela's footsteps across the stairs between the first floor and the second floor to the second floor. After passing through the long and narrow corridor on the second floor, Pessely and Jerome came to the door of a room at the end of the second floor. Cough. A violent cough came from the room, and Jerome's mood undoubtedly became worse. Percy knocked on the door softly, and a pleasant London accent came from the room. "Please come in." "Let me come." Just when Percy wanted to push the door and enter, Jerome stopped the Percy soldier and clenched the door handle. "There are some things that you still need to face calmly." Jerome took a deep breath and calmed himself down. He pressed the door of the house with one hand, clenched the handle of the door with the other hand, and gently pushed the door open. With the sound of crunch and crunch from the door, everything inside the door entered Jerome's line of sight. A middle-aged man was lying on a gorgeous brown-yellow carved four-corner post bed. He turned his head to the position close to his left hand, and beside his right hand was a handsome man with blonde hair and tearful eyes. The woman, her hand was tightly clasped with the middle-aged man's, and her eyes followed the middle-aged man to the back of the door. Behind the woman was a doctor in a black dress with his back to the door. Seeing his ups and downs, he seemed to be fiddling with something. The middle-aged man, who seemed to be dying, was the leader of the Bonaparte family, the future Emperor Napoleon III Louis Bonaparte. Sitting next to him is Louis Bonaparte's new love in Britain, Miss Howard, a London lover. Historically, he would return to Paris for elections at the end of April, before entering the presidency in December. Surrounded by French peasants in December 1851, he launched a coup and became the consul for life of France. In 1852, he was crowned Emperor of France. Of course, Miss Howard would break up with him after he became emperor. Reading www.urkanshu.com. However, it seems that everything will be a bubble. Louis Bonaparte's face, that was getting thinner due to the torment of illness, was a little surprised when he looked at Jerome, and then he showed a relieved expression. He stretched out his bony arm and said in a hoarse voice, "My cousin, you are finally here." After speaking, the middle-aged man began to cough violently again, his expression gradually becoming painful. All the blonde the side could do was to lightly stroke his back to reduce the middle-aged man's pain. "I'm thirsty. I want water. Drink water." Louis Bonaparte groaned in pain. His hand kept groping back and forth towards the wardrobe beside the post bed, but he couldn't reach the water glass. Seeing this, Jerome also hurried to Louis Bonaparte to help him get the water glass. At this moment, the unique London accent of the doctor in white coat appeared in the ears of everyone present. "If you don't want to be infected, I advise you to stay away from him." Jerome's cholera, which was warned by doctors, was called a Class A infectious disease in later generations. Its infection rate and fatality rate were extremely high, but Jerome did not stop because of the doctor's warning in front of Louis Bonaparte. He held his bony hand in silence. Holding his arm, Napoleon III stopped moaning and looked at his cousin. His dry lips seemed to want to say something. "It's alright, cousin. You will be alright." Jerome, who was holding Louis Bonaparte's palm, could only comfort him as much as possible. Judging from the current situation, his cousin may have passed away. Optimal treatment period. In the later stage of cholera, with systemic organ failure, even the medical system of later generations cannot recover, let alone the current 19th century. Chapter 5. Care from Albert. Seeing that the patient's family did not follow his suggestions, the doctor silently muttered in his heart, "Another guy who is not afraid of death." "Miss Howard, please move your body a little. I'm going to start treatment." The doctor tried to lower his voice so that his voice was not so rude. Jerome raised his head and noticed the doctor behind Miss Howard. The white doctor's coat had a chubby face, and his whiskers and eagle eyes didn't look like a man walking in a wealthy area. A well-mannered gentleman, rather like a butcher from the slums of London, especially with what looks like a hammer in his hand. Jerome looked up and down at the fat doctor in front of him, with a hint of distrust in his eyes. Are 19th century doctors really not butchers reincarnated? "Sir, please don't look at me like this," the fat doctor said to Jerome angrily. "This is Dr. James." Miss Howard hurriedly explained to Jerome. "He is the most famous doctor in the whole of London." 1. Dr. Fat. "No, it should be Dr. James," who corrected Miss Howard's mistake with a happy smile on the corner of his mouth, and said humbly, "I'm also an academician of the Royal Society of British Medicine, invited by Prince Albert to treat the British royal family." Jerome's expression changed slightly. He didn't expect his cousin to hook up with the British royal family in just 1 year. The royal doctors who treated the British royal family were all guys with eyes above their heads, and the Bonaparte family was just a poor aristocrat with a better name, and its actual assets were not as good as some emerging bankers. Could it be that his cousin really received Albert's gold pounds as rumored in his previous life? Right now is not the time to ask his cousin if he has hooked up with Queen Victoria. Jerome only hopes that his cousin can escape the disaster safely. The wealth and hope of the Bonaparte family are all pinned on his cousin, Dr. I. Jerome was about to say something when Dr. James shook his head and motioned Jerome to speak with his eyes. Jerome slowly let go of Louis Bonaparte, who was losing weight due to illness, and followed Dr. James out to speak. Only Miss Howard and Louis Bonaparte were left with tears in the room. Point in the corridor. Dr. James lowered his eyebrows and said in a dignified voice, "You came just in time. If you come back later, I'm afraid you won't be able to see the patient." Jerome showed a melancholy expression and asked in a low voice, "Doctor, cousin, he is really helpless." Dr. James spread his hands and said, "I have extended the patient's life as much as possible." Then, he sighed again and said, "It's too late for you to find out. If it had been earlier, I'm afraid there would have been rescue. Britain has not had cholera for more than 10 years, and the last cholera was in 1832. More than 10 years, enough time for us to relax." In the 19th century, cholera virus was often confused with enteritis, and many doctors treated cholera as enteritis, so that they missed the best life-saving cycle. "Cousin, how long can you last?" Jerome asked Dr. James. Even though there were 10,000 reasons in his heart not to believe that his cousin would jump on the street so quickly, Jerome had to accept the fact that his own little butterfly flapped his wings and caused his cousin's death. It may only be 3 or 5 days, or maybe a month. The patient's consciousness is getting more and more blurred, and the sweat discharge is getting worse. The head is also hot. Dr. James replied without any fluctuations in his tone. "The enema can no longer start any effect, although willow juice can suppress the patient's fever, but this situation may not last for long. That kind of thing is not good for the stomach." Note 1. Willow sap, aspirin. Jerome's expression was surprised at first, then relieved. Since ancient times, Eastern and Western medicine have used willow bark to boil water to suppress fever. Although they learned that willow bark contains salicylic acid a few years later, it does not hinder their pragmatism. If the fever and dehydration can be suppressed, will the cousin's illness last for a while? The patient sweats too much, and the electrolytes in the body must be out of balance. Jerome muttered to himself, recalling what he had learned in high school. Can Dr. James use the intravenous method to inject saline into the patient's body to replenish the actual fluid in the body? Jerome asked Dr. James. Intravenous injection? Dr. James shook his head and said, "This risk is too great. The last time someone had thought of this method for cholera, but only 8 of the 25 cases were cured. There's no other way right now, is there?" Jerome said helplessly. "Instead of holding on to the shortcomings, it's better to try a new method. No matter how bad it is, there's nowhere to go." "That's right. It can't be any worse," Dr. James said, looking up and down Jerome, as if he had seen something rare. "Where did you know about the intravenous infusion method?" "This method only a few in the medical community know. If you lived in 200 years, you would know it." Jerome responded vaguely, "I only learned about it by visiting the French Academy of Sciences by chance." French Academy of Sciences. Dr. James showed a fascinated expression. If the British Royal College of Medicine is the Hall of Glory for doctors in the UK, the French Academy of Sciences is the Hall of Glory for the whole of Europe. Countless ideas burst out from the French Academy of Sciences, and countless ideas came from the French Academy of Sciences. What is even more commendable is that the French Academy of Sciences has always been adhering to an inclusive attitude towards everyone. Everyone here means Europeans and a few Russians. The French Academy of Sciences, which is more equal and tolerant than the answer. Apart from your daily riots in France, you are not without merits. Dr. James said half jokingly and half seriously. "If everyone is satisfied with life, who wants to be a thug?" Jerome shrugged and replied, "I'm a little envious of Britannia." "What do you envy Britain for?" Dr. James asked curiously. "As a gentleman, He also has a patriotism. I envy you and Syrians for being obedient. Jerome said angrily, if we were in France, London would have no idea how many revolutions there have been. PS 1. Enema was the most popular method of treating cholera in the 19th century. Chapter 6. The Arrogance of the Angsa Gang. Jerome's innuendo embarrassed Dr. James for a few seconds. This revolutionary wind blown by the London Stock Exchange, Note 1, did not set off a revolution in its birthplace, but set off a revolution across the English Channel. A massive revolutionary movement, which in turn reacted against Britain, forcing Britain to reform. In order to maintain his last remaining patriotism, Dr. James stubbornly retorted, we Ansa people are a nation with a spirit of contract, and they will definitely not be like those mobs in France, PFFT. Ha ha ha, the spirit of the contract? Jerome couldn't help laughing out loud. This laughter made Dr. James feel annoyed, and he couldn't help but refute, Your Excellency, what's so funny? Jerome restrained his smile, and responded with a very crooked expression, Sir, what you call the spirit of the contract is, that the factory owner can fire workers freely? Does it represent the spirit of the contract, that the poor are free to starve to death? Is the abolition of the poor also the spirit of the contract? Jerome's barrage of questions made Dr. James speechless. With his petty bourgeois nature, on the one hand, he had a little sympathy for the bottom, but on the other hand, he also hated change. Any change has the potential to bring his class down, and James feels uncomfortable every time he thinks of being in the company of those filthy workers. Not to mention the day and night of the British Kingdom's propaganda to demonize the revolution, making those middle class people rather choose reform than revolution. After a while, James then retorted, the revolution brings only destruction and chaos. It brings opportunities for the careerists. Your Bonaparte family is the beneficiary of the riot. Of course you spare no effort in propaganda revolution, sir. Facing the issue of Bonaparte's honor, Jerome's expression was extremely solemn. He flicked the dust of his shirt and said in a serious tone, the Bonaparte family has never been the beneficiary of the revolution. Glory never comes from ancient surnames, but from all French people. The Bonaparte family was chosen by the French people to be the spokesperson of the French people. When France does not need Bonaparte, the French people will let France off the stage. Revolutions may bring disorderly riots, but riots will not last long. A new government will appear. Whether it is a republic or an empire, it is just a product to maintain order. Besides, France is not a nation that can only riot. Revolutions will always have highs and lows. The Bonaparte family is also not a radical family. We also long for a group. While promoting the theory of his revolutionary conservatives, Jerome carefully observed the expression of Dr. James at first. Dr. James resisted Jerome's answer. When Jerome talked about maintaining the existing order and system and carrying out appropriate reforms, Dr. James's expression gradually agreed with him. Hope everything goes well. Jerome thought silently in his heart. Okay, Your Excellency, I'm just a doctor, and I'm not interested in political topics. Dr. James said to Jerome against his will, sorry, doctor. Jerome also pretended to be apologetic in response. I always talk about politics when I talk about it. Huh. A glint of light flashed in Dr. James' eyes, and he still asked casually, Your Excellency, I heard that France is holding a general election. I don't know if you will participate. Of course. Jerome nodded without hesitation, and then added, not only me, but the entire Bonaparte family will participate. Do you want to return to France? Dr. James's tone was a little hurried. He seemed to be too concerned about the situation of the Bonaparte family. I said that as long as the French people need it, the Bonaparte family can come back to the stage at any time. Jerome responded with a smile. Then, the conversation changed. However, the Bonaparte family is not willing to destroy the order under the existing system. The era of revolution has passed, and the Bonaparte family does not want to undertake the task of destroying Europe. You can't. Dr. James seemed to want to say something, and Jerome immediately interrupted Dr. James and reminded, Doctor, the topic we are discussing has gone beyond the boundary between doctors and family members. I now suspect that what I'm facing is not a doctor, but a British bureaucrat. Only then did Dr. James realize that he seemed to have overstepped. He chuckled and turned into the room. Jerome, who stayed in place, muttered softly, "I don't know if these words will reach Buckingham Palace. It's really exciting." In the room, Dr. James told Louis Bonaparte and Miss Howard about the intravenous injection and the condition of Napoleon III's body. "You mean Louis? How long has his body been unable to support him?" Although Howard already had boldness in his heart. You reading www.orkanshu.com. But when the doctor handed down the death verdict, she couldn't help crying. "Yes," said Dr. James regretfully, "His Excellency the Prince's disease was discovered too late, and now all we can do is prolong the Prince's life as much as possible. Although the intravenous injection method is somewhat dangerous, it may make the Prince you can hold on longer. Risk his life, just to make Louis's life last longer." "I don't agree." Howard rejected Dr. James' suggestion. Dr. James turned his attention to Jerome. He hoped Jerome could convince Howard. "Doctor, I agree with your plan." Louis Bonaparte's weak voice came from the hospital bed. "No, Louis is too dangerous." Howard grabbed Louis' hand and responded, "I can't lose you." "Howard, it's nothing." Napoleon III reassured in a hoarse voice, "I have been in a hail of bullets in Italy, and this danger is nothing to me." Note 2. The terminally ill Louis Bonaparte seemed to have regained his former splendor. An indescribable confidence and calm burst out of his body. At Louis Bonaparte's request, Howard agreed to a plan for intravenous therapy. P.S. 1. The failed potato harvest in Ireland in 1847 caused volatility in the British stock exchange market, and the railroad bubble advocated was mercilessly shattered along with the volatility and spread throughout Europe. Under the double blow of the economic downturn and the potato crisis, the people of Paris set off a great revolution too. In 1831, Napoleon III and his elder brother participated in the anti-pope uprising in Rome. In the end, the two brothers did not fully participate in the uprising because of the attitude of the leaders of the rebel army towards Austria and France. Chapter 7. Conversation with Louis Napoleon. Due to the constraints of scientific and technological factors in the 19th century, Dr. Jerome and James could not make physiological saline for medical use as in later generations. They could only choose the oldest method to distill 500 milliliters of water that had been sterilized at high temperature and add evaporated. The well-salt crystals that have been concentrated 3 or 4 times are mixed according to the ratio of 1:0.009, and a semi-finished physiological saline is produced. Physiological saline was injected intravenously into Louis Bonaparte's body by Dr. James. Louis Bonaparte's severely dehydrated body barely recovered a trace of blood. "Your Excellency, drink this." Dr. James brought a bowl of viscous and slightly forgiving liquid to Louis Bonaparte's mouth. The liquid is made from willow bark mixed with something that even Jerome does not know. It is said to have analgesic and gastrointestinal effects. The salicylic acid contained in the juice made from willow bark can relieve Louis Bonaparte's fever. Louis Bonaparte reluctantly opened his mouth, and steaming green juice poured into Louis Bonaparte's mouth. Perhaps because the taste of the juice itself is too anti-human, Louis Bonaparte apparently spit it out the moment he drank it. Dr. James hurriedly took out and twisted the towel placed in the copper warm water basin under the pillow bed. After drying, put it lightly on Louis Bonaparte's mouth to prevent Louis Bonaparte from spitting all over the floor. By reviewing the information about cholera in Britain more than 10 years ago, Dr. James can roughly determine that the transmission route of cholera is generally food and water. As long as the transmission route and source of cholera viruses are strictly controlled, cholera can be prevented. The way we keep advocating ventilation simply won't work. Louis Bonaparte's Adam's apple slowly wriggled, and he swallowed Dr. James' medicine with difficulty. Dr. James slowly took the towel from Louis Bonaparte's mouth and folded it. After the rectangular towel was folded into the shape of a tofu block by Dr. James, Dr. James handed the towel to Jerome and instructed, "This towel contaminated with the patient's body fluids. It can no longer be used. Burn it." Jerome, who took the towel, nodded. No one understood the dangers of the cholera virus better than him. The reason why the cholera virus occurs in the slums and rarely occur in the wealthy areas is not only because the poor cannot afford doctors, but also because they do not have a correct understanding of cholera, and they often have intimate relationships with cholera patients after they have cholera contact, which will lead to a person contracting cholera, and the whole family will die. The casual burning behavior of Jerome is absolutely unacceptable to the ordinary working class. Those workers who have to wear a pair of trousers together do not have so much money on weekdays, let alone in 1848, when the economy crisis has not recovered. Jerome put the towel, that might be contaminated with the cholera virus, in the kindling pot next to the fireplace in the living room on the first floor. He held the flint on the fireplace and the kerosene-stained cotton wool in his hand. The flint rubbed against the fireplace to generate the sparks, ignited the cotton wool, and the flames of the inner blow and outer fire were pinched by Jerome and thrown into the brazier, and the towel in the basin was ignited. With the generation of thick black smoke, a pungent smell of burnt wool poured into Jerome's breath. Seeing this, Pursley and Fleury, who were still on the first floor, hurriedly opened the doors and windows to ventilate. After doing all this, Jerome returned to the second floor again, and Pursley followed him upstairs. At this time, Dr. James had packed all his things and was ready to leave with a small wooden box point on the occasion of parting. Dr. James did not forget to ask Louis Bonaparte to relax, and at the same time, told Jerome and Howard to be careful. "Pursley, help me get a doctor." Louis Bonaparte, who looked a little better than before, said to Pursley, "Respect." Pursley bowed to Louis Bonaparte point after Dr. James and Pursley left. There were only 3 people left in the room: Louis Bonaparte, Jerome Bonaparte and Howard Point. The scene fell into a dead silence for a while, and after a short silence, Louis Bonaparte, who had recovered a little, said to Howard in a hoarse voice, "Dear Howard, can you fulfill one of my requests?" "Louis, you say it." Howard held Louis Bonaparte's hand and said affectionately, "Can you please help me buy a newspaper? I haven't reported it for a long time." Louis Bonaparte pleaded to Howard. "Louis, I promise you." Howard immediately agreed to Louis Bonaparte's request. Louis Bonaparte smiled, and he named several newspapers in one breath, such as the Times, Polar Star, Greenland. Note 1. Howard wrote down what Louis Bonaparte said about the newspaper, and again instructed Louis Bonaparte in the doctor's tone to take care of his illness and leave to help Louis Bonaparte buy the newspaper only 2 cousins. Louis Bonaparte and Jerome Bonaparte were left in the room. Just when Jerome didn't know how to speak, reading www.can'tcom. Louis Bonaparte's voice reached his ears. "Howard is such a smart girl, huh?" Jerome Bonaparte did not understand what Louis Bonaparte meant. "My dear cousin, you don't really think I asked her to go out and buy newspapers?" Louis Bonaparte said to Jerome with a smile on his hoarse throat. Only then did Jerome react. "Cousin, are you trying to get rid of her?" "That's right." Louis Bonaparte nodded, then sighed. "I said Howard is a smart lady. I don't want to be involved in our business. She is always an outsider to the family, especially after I'm dead. I'm so afraid of her." "Cousin, don't worry. The family cannot trouble her." Jerome comforted Louis Bonaparte. "I hope I think too much." Louis Bonaparte showed a mocking expression. "My uncles, all of them really don't give me peace of mind." Then, he paused and added, "Of course, except for Uncle Jerome. I'm very grateful and miss Uncle Jerome. I think you miss my sister." Jerome silently added in his heart, and said with a respectful face, "My father misses you very much too." "Of course, and my sister, Mathilde, my god." P.S. 1. Polaris, a British charter organ and a left-wing ideological newspaper. Marx once published an article in the Polaris after he was sent out of the country by the Prussian Gift, Rhinelander. Marx founded the newspaper in the Rhineland period. The newspaper did not last long before being banned by Prussia. The content of the newspaper has been published in Britain in the form of reprint by Polaris. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 8. Analysis of the situation in France. Louis Bonaparte, who heard that Mathilde was worried about his safety, was very excited. After the excitement, Louis Bonaparte realized that his performance seemed to be too much. After all, Mathilde was already married. She has become a person who has 2 parallel world lines that do not intersect, not to mention that now he is terminally ill and may face death at any time. After calming down, Louis Bonaparte stammered and asked, as if he had entered the sage mode, "Your sister, my cousin. How are you doing now?" Jerome shook his head and sighed. "Since my sister divorced that Russian rich man, she has been wandering around all day. Although she pretended to be indifferent on the surface, I know that the failed marriage was right for you. She hits really hard." Jerome's voice was not very loud, but when it reached Louis Bonaparte's ear, it passed through his eardrum like a bell and hit Louis Bonaparte's brain. Louis Bonaparte's brain. Bonaparte's brain went blank. Muttering in a low voice, "It's all my fault. If it wasn't me." Mathilde and Louis Bonaparte were childhood cousins. The two loved each other and looked forward to the future. No one in the Bonaparte family believed that their future would become too familiar one stranger. When Louis Bonaparte was 20 years old, Louis Bonaparte's mother, the former King of Holland, Queen Hortense, and Jerome Bonaparte's father, Jerome the Elder, discussed the engagement of their two children. Mew agreed to the request of Queen Hortense, who bought an apartment in Switzerland for her only remaining son, and also gave Louis Bonaparte 3 million francs in cash and bonds, which means that Louis Bonaparte received an annual annuity of 120,000 francs in France at that time. A small factory owner worked day and night for only about 20,000 francs a year, and the 120,000 annuity was enough for their young couple to support themselves in Switzerland. It is a pity that the day did not go according to plan. Louis Bonaparte did not follow Hortense's arrangement, but insisted on carrying out the second coup d'état, that is, the coup d'état in Strasbourg. Louis Bonaparte was successfully put in prison. This time, the July dynasty was not as easy to talk as the first time. Even if the celebrities in Paris were begging for Bonaparte, Prime Minister Sert still insisted on killing Louis Bonaparte. Bey was sentenced to life imprisonment. The sentence of life imprisonment made Jerome's sister Mathilde feel the gloom of life. There is a saying that the house leaked and it rained overnight. After hearing that Louis Bonaparte was betrayed and sentenced to life imprisonment, old Jerome's creditors immediately thought that Hortense might not help old Jerome pay off foreign debts as a family member. They came to collect debts one after another. In order to help her father pay off foreign debts, Mathilde could only marry a 26-year-old rich Russian. This marriage only lasted less than 5 years and was on the verge of breaking up. Mathilde returned from Moscow. Paris. Louis Bonaparte also escaped from prison. No. Jerome spread his hands and sighed, feeling sad for the misfortune of his sister and cousin. This is a tragedy in itself, and we can only blame the merciful God for letting the two truly love each other. People are tormented. Why fate is so incomprehensible as a ruthless female cousin. Why my father owes a huge amount of foreign debt. Louis Bonaparte remained silent, his eyelids drooping slightly. Did he has any resentment against Uncle Jerome, old Jerome, in his heart, but every time he thought of his cousin and cousin's support for him, the resentment in his heart was washed away again. Forget it. Let's not talk about these old sesame and rotten millet things. Louis Bonaparte had already let go of everything, but on this special occasion today, Jerome brought back memories of his old feelings. Well, stop talking. Jerome decisively cut off the topic. Some things must be stopped when they should be enough. Jerome, my brother. Louis Bonaparte decided to get to the point. He said in a hoarse voice with affection, "After my death, would you like to take over the flag of the patriarch of the Bonaparte family and continue to fight for it? Fight for the cause of the Bonaparte family." The words of Louis Bonaparte made Jerome's heart beat twice. Point the banner of the Bonaparte family? What a revolutionary title. Although the Bonaparte family now has only illusory titles and a bunch of illusory honors, these things can help Jerome get what he wants under certain circumstances in France. Bonaparte has not only represented a person and a family, but also a symbol. Silver coins with Napoleon's head were circulated into the French countryside. French farmers may not necessarily know who Napoleon was and what he did, but they just need to find the person they are familiar with in the crowd. The nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, the defender of the peasants, the supporter of the division of fields. These are enough to set off a storm in France. Jerome's wild thoughts made Louis Bonaparte inexplicably flustered. He didn't want to see the title of Patriarch Bonaparte fall on the heads of people other than Jerome Bonaparte. Otherwise those people would accuse him. Not sure how he will be programmed after his death. My dear cousin. Louis Bonaparte said eagerly, grabbing Jerome Bonaparte's wrist. Although the Bonaparte family has fallen into the dust, I believe that one day the Bonaparte family has fallen. Will be back on the fallen throne, yeah. Jerome nodded without doubt. History has proven the influence of the surname Bonaparte in France. Louis Bonaparte paused and said in a low voice, my cousin, you must know the current situation in France better than I do. Jerome Bonaparte answered gloatingly, the monarch was cast off the throne. The monarch was the orthodox name for Louis Philippe. Here is Jerome's nickname for Louis Philippe. The Republic has no place in Paris. Surrounded by trousers, he hurriedly crawled out of the tomb again. It's a pity that there is no second Robespierre, second Danton, second Mirror in this crappy republic that has been ripened. They don't even have a second Fouche. There is only one Lamartine who was still composing poetry and music before, an unintimidating mountain party, and a group of remnants standing in the ruins of the dynasty, and Bonn is returning to Paris from the countryside. How can the Republicans and this group of worms make good politics together? I watch this republic eat jujube pills. Chapter 9. Make a plan. Jerome Bonaparte's analysis far exceeded Louis Bonaparte's expectations. He originally just hoped that his cousin could have a little understanding of the current situation in France, and then use the little time left to analyze it for him. As a member of the Bonaparte family not involved in politics is not enough. What he didn't expect was that he never really knew his cousin, and his political sense of smell would be so keen. Louis Bonaparte looked up and down Jerome with scrutinizing eyes. His eyes seemed to penetrate Jerome's body and reach the depths of his soul. Jerome straightened his back. Although he was full of self-confidence on the surface, he was also a little uneasy in his heart, for fear that Louis Bonaparte would find out that Jerome was not normal. Who taught you the analysis just now? Louis Bonaparte said again, and Jerome was relieved. Jerome, who adjusted his state a little, pointed at his head and eyes calmly and said, these are all things I saw and thought of myself. No one wants to teach me. Besides, Jerome paused, showing a contemptuous smile and said, the city officials, note 1, who are sitting on the top of Paris 9 days, I'm afraid they are still thinking about how to suppress the next riots. Pack the workers into the national workshop. It's just a delay. It can't solve the unemployment problem in France once and for all, let alone those members of parliament who are scheming. Now Paris is like a powder keg. Jerome gestured in the air. It only takes a little spark, and the powder keg will ignite. Paris will then face the second division. At that time, the Republican can only kill the workers. Even if the Republic is lucky suppressing the workers, how can the Republicans achieve universal suffrage as they say? The memory of the citizens of Paris is not like the memory of a fish with only 7 seconds. In the original history, a second revolution triggered by the workers will come to Paris in 2 months. The nascent republic faces a crisis of division or death. Under the hardline policy of the parliament, the moderate Lamartine leaves the stage, replaced by the military strongman Cavaignac, and the republic has been torn apart. Since then. Jerome Bonaparte's answer made Louis Bonaparte ponder. He didn't expect to be in Paris for a long time, and most of the information he obtained was only from second-hand or even third-hand newspapers, which was far from Jerome's personal. The experience as dictation is more intuitive. My dear cousin, what do you think of this revolution? Louis Bonaparte asked Jerome Bonaparte with a serious expression. From now on, he no longer regards Jerome Bonaparte as a little brother who needs his care, but a flag bearer who is about to raise the Bonaparte flag. An opportunity. Jerome Bonaparte responded without hesitation, and then added, an opportunity for the Bonaparte family to return to French politics. The Bonaparte family has not returned to French power for 33 years. Central Paris. Jerome raised his hand and clenched his fist. We must seize this opportunity to return to Paris, just like His Majesty the Emperor. If we control Paris, we will control the whole of France. Jerome Bonaparte's ambitious words also aroused Louis Bonaparte's ambition. From 1830 to the present, Louis Bonaparte has never thought of conquering France, but every time it ends in failure. Right now, France's rights are in a vacuum, but her body can't take the lead. Remorse lingered in Louis Bonaparte's heart. The fire of ambition faded in his eyes gradually extinguished, leaving only a sigh. After sighing, Louis Bonaparte readjusted his emotions and looked at his cousin Jerome. He didn't have much time, but Jerome is still young. Maybe he can. Jerome, what's your plan? Louis Bonaparte folded his hands together and asked with a serious expression. Jerome slowly lowered his arms that were held high in the air, shook his head, and said with a wry smile, the original plan was to invite you to return to Paris and then participate in the Paris election. I believe that with Bonaparte's influence in France, it will definitely be able to win the election, defeat the weak Republicans, and seize the throne of France. Can we really seize the rights of France? The two defeats made Louis Bonaparte a little hesitant and confused. He believed that he could seize the rights, but is it too child's play to seize the rights through elections? Even the uncle he advocated was only after he took control of the army and then used public opinion to paint a false democratic code for his coronation. Whether we can seize power actually depends not on ourselves, but on our opponents. Jerome Bonaparte said confidently, as long as the Republicans continue to implement the universal suffrage system, then the massive rural vote base will be lost. We use it. The French president has it at his fingertips. Louis Bonaparte was also very moved by the scene described by Jerome Bonaparte, but his body no longer allowed him to continue running for elections. Louis Bonaparte turned his attention to Jerome again. This time, his face showed a relieved smile. The mustache on his face stretched out with Louis Bonaparte's smile. He stretched out his hand to hold the heat. From Bonaparte's shoulder said, I think your plan should be changed. Change? Jerome Bonaparte instantly understood what he meant. He shook his head and laughed at himself. I'm just an unknown person with some Bonaparte family titles. I'm afraid not many people in Paris can recognize it. Me. Cousin, you are different. The two coups made you famous. The book Eradication of Poverty mixed with Paris, and you have met a erudite Prince Bonaparte. These are all things I did in a short time. It's impossible to have inside. You can too. Louis Bonaparte said firmly. Trust me, cousin. Sometimes, a dead person is worth more than a living person. Because the dead need to use the mouth of the living to tell their exploits. The living are happy to share the glory of the dead. Especially a dead man who has not made a mistake. Jerome did not understand what Louis Bonaparte meant. I tell you. Louis Bonaparte whispered in Jerome's ear. No, I don't agree. Jerome Bonaparte opened his eyes wide and pursed his lips. Cousin, you must listen to me this time. Louis Bonaparte said to Jerome resolutely, I have a hunch that this is the last chance for the Bonaparte family. If this fails, we may not be able to return to French politics again. P.S. 1. A derogatory term for the Parisian bureaucracy. Chapter 10. Buckingham Palace. The conspiracy between Louis Bonaparte and Jerome Bonaparte is in full swing. A secret meeting is also about to take place at Buckingham Palace in Piccadilly, East London. Buckingham Palace is not far from the residence of Napoleon III in the UK. I'm afraid Napoleon himself did not expect that the Bonaparte family and the Hanover family would become neighbors 27 years after his death. A black carriage slowly drove into the trail on the left side of Dicker Geography Street, and the driver stopped the carriage and tapped the box behind him with his fingers and said honestly, Sir, I can only deliver it to you here. After hearing the coachman's response, the person in the box opened the door and lowered the steps to get off. This person was Dr. James from Louis Bonaparte's mansion. How much? Dr. James asked the coachman for the price, while groping for the few silver coins in his pocket with his head down. Sir, a total of 2 shillings. Note 1, the coachman replied softly. Dr. James raised his head and widened his eyes and shouted, What? It costs me 2 shillings for such a short distance. Is your carriage inlaid with gold? Sir, I'm really sorry. At present, London is still in turmoil, and prices continue to rise, so we have to raise prices to deal with the crisis. I hope you can understand. Understand? I forgive you. Who will forgive us? Got. It's 2 shillings for such a short distance, and it's easier for you than robbery. Although the coachman apologized to James, the coachman never gave in on the price. After the scene fell into a temporary stalemate, Dr. James, who was unwilling to delay, was defeated. He scolded and popped out a silver coin with Queen Victoria's head on it and gave it to the coachman. Thank you, Mr. Generosity. The coachman who took the silver coin smiled instantly and thanked Dr. James happily. Go to hell. You are really a bunch of vampires. I swear I'll never be your car again. Dr. James cursed and entered the same lane of Buckingham Palace. The coachman also drove the carriage away. As for the oath to never make a carriage again, it was just a joke to the coachman. How could a decent person like them go out on foot? Across the long and narrow path. It is an open field. The front of the open area is James Park, from which you can see Buckingham Palace in the center of St. James's Park. Dr. James walked on the road leading to Buckingham Palace without craving for the scenery along the way. He soon came to the main gate of Buckingham Palace. This is Buckingham Palace. Do you have any invitations? Two soldiers in bright red military uniforms and high-legged military caps blocked Dr. James' progress and got him. They were the soldiers who were in charge of guarding Buckingham Palace. Right now is a time of turmoil, and they must carefully check everyone who goes to Buckingham Palace. Dr. James slightly adjusted his tie and shirt and said hurriedly, "Please let Albert know that Dr. James has important information to report to him." "Are you Dr. James?" The soldier looked up and down at the unremarkable guy in front of him. "I'm James, an academician of the Royal Society of Medicine." Dr. James responded proudly with a straight back. Being able to join the Royal Society is something that every scholar is proud of, especially now that the threshold for entering the Royal Society is becoming more and more difficult. Well, royal dating is already on the verge of becoming a gathering place for the elite. Then, go in. The soldier rearranged the crossed front-loaded guns and opened the path that could only accommodate one person. James finally stepped into the inner courtyard of St. James Park. After a while, a burly man wearing a Scottish kilt appeared. "Mr. Brown." Dr. James was a little flattered by the arrival of the strong man, and he hurriedly greeted the strong man in front of him. Born in 1826, John Brown was the son of a Scottish tenant farmer and used to be a groom at Balmoral Castle. When Prince Albert bought the castle, John became Prince Albert's personal servant with great ability and loyalty. After Albert and Victoria married, John Brown, who was 14 years younger, also became the big housekeeper of the Hanover royal family, and the big housekeeper sat for 8 years. Even though John Brown looked like he was in his 30s, his actual age was only 22. John Brown, who has been the chief steward of the royal family since the age of 22, said lightly with a characteristic arrogance, "Come with me, Prince, I'm talking with the Prime Minister now." "Yes, yes." In the face of the proud royal housekeeper, Dr. James no longer had the pride he had before, and he could only follow John Brown's side obediently. Under the leadership of Dr. James, John Brown came to the main hall of Buckingham Palace. A brown-yellow velvet blanket is laid throughout the hall. Every arch is inlaid with golden fringes. A gilded chandelier hangs directly above the living room, and the whole room seems to be enveloped in gold when the sun shines through the window. "I'll take you to the lounge first, and I'll call you after the conversation between the prince and the prime minister is over," John Brown said to Dr. James in his characteristic Scottish rough tone. "Yes." Dr. James hurriedly responded all the way. Under the leadership of John Brown, Dr. James entered a certain room in the side hall through the arch of the main hall. Compared with the splendid main hall, the layout of the side rooms is so simple. A portrait of Victoria and Albert inlaid with gold trim, a sofa with beautifully carved patterns, and oil paintings that cover the entire wall are all in this room. Dr. James was anxiously waiting for the arrival of Prince Albert. After about an hour, a pleasant sound of pushing the door appeared in Dr. James's eardrive. James, who had just sat down, hurriedly got up to greet him. "I hope I'm not late," Albert said apologetically to Dr. James. No, I took the liberty to disturb you. I'm very sorry," James said excitedly, looking at the bearded Albert in front of him. "PS 1. Under the gold standard system in the 19th century, an ounce, 31.103 grams, of gold with a fineness of 11/12 gold can be minted at £3, 17 shillings and 10.5 pence. Each pound is equal to 20 shillings, and each shilling is equal to 12 pence. 2 shillings is about $70 today. Chapter 11. Jerome. "Please sit down, Prince." Albert, with a look of deep tiredness on his face, politely invited Dr. James to sit down, and Prince Albert did not sit down until Dr. James carefully sat in the corner of the long sofa. Prince Albert, who had just sat down, politely asked, "Tea or coffee?" His Royal Highness, you don't need to spend so much trouble. Dr. James responded with a flattered wave. Prince Albert seemed to turn a deaf ear and said to himself, then let's have tea. I haven't tasted the black tea that the East India Company paid tribute to for a long time. After standing aside, John Brown saluted Prince Albert and left the room to prepare snacks for Prince Albert. There were only 2 people left in the room, Prince Albert and Dr. James, and the whole room fell into a brief silence. Dr. James put his hands on his legs dignifiedly, and his eyes secretly pointed to Prince Albert from time to time. He was waiting for Prince Albert to speak. Dr. James, how is Louis Bonaparte's situation now? Albert's London accent full of German accents came to Dr. James' ears, which gave Dr. James a little peace of mind. If the leader does not speak, he is afraid that the leader will not speak. Once the leader does not speak, it means that the work you do makes him very dissatisfied, and the rest of the results are self-evident. Dr. James adjusted his state in a very short time and reorganized his language. His Royal Highness, Louis Bonaparte's situation is not optimistic. Cholera has already affected his organs, and it is estimated that it will not last for long. Drive. James raised his head slightly to observe Albert's expression. From Albert's expression, Dr. James found nothing, and the flustered Dr. James added again, however, I will try my best to treat Louis Bonaparte. Prince Albert looked indifferent, and he could only express a trace of regret in his heart for Louis Bonaparte's illness. Although Prince Albert had never met Louis Bonaparte once, he had already learned of Louis Bonaparte from the Mayor of London and the British bureaucrats who had contact with Louis Bonaparte. Everything of point from the perspective of Britain. Louis Bonaparte is undoubtedly an excellent chess piece. If used properly, it can undoubtedly have a huge impact on France. The duality of revolution and conservatism represented by Bonaparte would stabilize the troubled country across the Channel for Britain. The thought of Albert, the turbulent country on the other side of the strait, gave me a headache. The revolution is like a cancer that can quickly spread from one country to another, and the usually submissive subjects will become mob under the revolutionary poison. In order to stabilize France, Britain has thought of countless ways. They used bayonets to put the Bourbon dynasty, which represented the old system, on the throne, in an attempt to restore the old system in France. However, the throne of the Bourbon dynasty has not lasted for 20 years. Accurate it is said that in 14 years, he was overthrown by the Paris mob, and the king was forced to flee into exile. The young Bourbons ascended the throne of France. In order to maintain the existing order and prevent the French mob from returning to the stage, Britain pinched its nose and recognized the kingdom established by the descendants of the Kingslayer. However, the Bourbon Sprout Kingdom only survived for 18 years before it was overturned by another revolution. After the establishment of the republic that once terrified the whole of Europe, those obedient people who were suppressed by Britain gradually became less obedient. Fortunately, the republic on the other side did not incite the mob across Europe to rebel against their monarch like its predecessors a few decades ago, and they abandoned this powerful tone and thought only of their own protection. Britain and the whole of Europe breathed a sigh of relief, but Albert was unwilling to believe in this republic. As long as the republic existed, one day as the sword of Damocles hanging over the heads of all European monarchies, the army under the arm of a million mob would like locusts hoping to wash over the whole of Europe. Once they are united with the mob under the European monarchy, there will be no country in the whole of Europe that can resist those guys, so they must find a guy who can control that irascible country. Louis Bonaparte is obviously a good candidate, born of Bonaparte blood. He was obviously the natural ruler of France, and he had the courage of his uncle's heart, but he did not have the military command ability of his uncle. If he is allowed to become the ruler of France, France will become a country with more than enough defense and insufficient attack. Britain and all of Europe can sit back and relax, and the French Republic does not rule indefinitely. As long as France is stable, Albert can use the Orleans faction card in his hand to support the Bourbon family again. But now that Louis Bonaparte is about to die, Albert can only turn to consider new candidates. Reading www.urkanshu.com Young Bourbon or Long Bourbon. While thinking about the kingdom's next investment target, Albert stepped forward and patted Dr. James on the shoulder to reassure him. Some things just do your best, Dr. James. I understand. His Royal Highness. Although James said something clear, he still felt a little guilty in his heart. Prince Albert entrusted him with such an important task, but he failed to complete it himself. He betrayed Prince Albert's trust in her etc. Maybe you can tell His Royal Highness about this. Dr. James suddenly thought of something, and he hurriedly reported, His Royal Highness, Jerome Bonaparte, the younger brother of Louis Bonaparte, came to London from France. Albert raised a little bit of interest and nodded to himself. Louis Bonaparte is his cousin, and it is reasonable for him to come to London from France to visit Louis Bonaparte. His Royal Highness, I also heard that Jerome Bonaparte is preparing to run for the French election. Dr. James hurriedly added point this time. Prince Albert can no longer keep an indifferent attitude. The news that the Bonaparte family is participating in the French election is really surprising. The French side actually agreed to the Bonaparte family's participation in the election. Prince Albert realized that he still had too little understanding of the internal situation of the French Republic. Is it because the Republicans deliberately indulged, or there are other reasons? His Royal Highness, please be careful. That guy Jerome Bonaparte is an ambitious guy. Dr. James said worriedly. He wants France to return to Bonaparte's arms, and for it put it in action. Chapter 12. Passionate Victoria. Ambitious. Albert's face rose slightly, and his strong curiosity made him shift the target from Louis Napoleon to Jerome Bonaparte, and subconsciously spit out a German word from his mouth. The Bonaparte family really has the blood of a Corsican rebel in its bones. Prince Albert sighed silently in his heart. More than 30 years have passed since Napoleon Bonaparte lost the throne. The Bonaparte family has never stopped chasing the throne for a moment, and Bonaparte's henchmen have never given up for a day. Point from Count Lechstade, King of Rome, Napoleon Louis, Louis Napoleon's brother, Louis Napoleon, and now Jerome Bonaparte. The second generation of the Bonaparte family has been chosen. After losing 3, they still did not give up on the throne of France. Point Albert didn't know whether to call them perseverance or give up. That's right. His Royal Highness. Dr. James informed Prince Albert of his conversation with Jerome one by one. Prince Albert's brows were sometimes furrowed, sometimes relieved, and he got up and paced back and forth in the small room. Seeing this, Dr. James also did not dare to continue sitting on the sofa. He hurriedly followed Prince Albert and stood on the sofa. Every now and then, aim at Albert. Your Highness, the black tea is here. Rough Scottish accented English came from outside the door, pulling Albert back from thinking to reality. Albert came back to his senses and looked at Dr. James with an embarrassed expression, with an apologetic expression on his face again. Dr. James, I'm very sorry. Because of me. His Royal Highness, it's nothing. Dr. James hurriedly waved his hand in response, and then saluted. It's my honor to be able to serve the royal family. Then please sit down. After being greeted by Albert, Dr. James sat down again, and several attendants carefully placed a small round table carved from pine wood in front of Dr. James and Albert. Immediately afterwards, a saucer of snacks, a small pot of black tea, and 2 small black teacups were placed on the round table. John Brown carefully picked up the black teapot and poured it into one of the cups, then took a step back and returned to the position of the attendant. Prince Albert carefully picked up the teacup and slowly blew 2 sips of hot air, then took a sip of black tea, showing an intoxicated expression. Although it is said that the taste of Indian black tea is not as good as the tea of its neighboring countries, it is better than the large quantity, which can ensure that every British citizen can drink authentic black tea. Black tea paired with milk and sugar cubes is a must for the British people to satisfy their hunger after a serious tasting. Prince Albert remembered Dr. James. He was about to get a teapot to help Dr. James pour tea. Unexpectedly, Dr. James took the lead and snatched it. Prince Albert's cup was filled with black tea again, and he poured himself black tea. By the way, a silent afternoon tea lasted only half an hour and ended. Prince Albert thought a lot, and Dr. James suffered for half an hour. His Royal Highness, it's time for me to go. Dr. James humbly expressed his willingness to leave to Prince Albert. Albert, who got the answer he wanted from Dr. James, was not willing to let the doctor continue to suffer. He politely expressed to Dr. James that he hoped to meet again next time and instructed John Brown to take this. The guests sent each other away. After Dr. James left with John Brown, Prince Albert also left the partial room. This time he came to a room in the backyard of Buckingham Palace. Along with Prince Albert's knock on the door, an elegant German "Please come in" came from the door. Prince Albert showed the uncle laugh of a mature man who made thousands of girls fascinated. A woman who is slightly bloated due to pregnancy is sitting on a long sofa with her hands crossed and her mouth humming a lullaby from German children while she is holding a sleeping elf in her arms. Victoria, you know. Albert didn't seem to notice the existence of the elf. His voice seemed to be higher than usual. Shh. Victoria made a silent motion and pointed to the baby in her arms. Only then did Albert realize the existence of the child, and he hurriedly swallowed the words he was about to say. But it was all too late. The elf in Victoria's arms, who had just turned 1 month old, was awakened by her father's push on the door and the sound of noisy "Wow." Little elf cried aloud. Victoria looked at Albert complainingly, and then she could only laugh twice. Victoria shook her arms gently while continuing to hum a song from Germany. The little baby stopped making noise under the mother's gentle care and singing. You reading www.can'tyu.com quietly stared at the mother in front of him. Several maids outside the door thought the child was hungry again after hearing the cry inside the door, so they hurriedly found the nurse who was stranded at Buckingham Palace. The nurse followed the maid into the room, looked at Victoria and the princess in her hands and said, "Your Majesty, I'll do it." Victoria once again gave Albert a reproachful look, handing the princess over to the nurse and instructing them to take good care of the princess. The nurse carefully held the little princess in Victoria's arms in her arms and gave Victoria a slight salute before leaving the room. Only Victoria and Albert were left in the room. "It's all your fault. Wake up, Louise." Queen Victoria pouted and complained to Albert like a little girl. "I'm afraid that no one can imagine that a woman who controls more than half of the world will show the same expression as a little girl." Looking at Victoria's childish expression, Prince Albert strode around Victoria and sat on the sofa, teasing, "If Lord Melbourne, note 1, notes, I will definitely teach you a straight face again." Lord Melbourne, who is a Whig Party member, is notoriously stubborn. After her succession, Victoria was taught by Lord Melbourne as her own daughter for 4 years, during which she taught her basic political means and methods. So Victoria respects Melbourne very much. The Lord has returned to his castle to retire, but he has nothing to do with us. Queen Victoria skillfully embraced Albert's neck with a charming expression. P.S. 1. Lord of Melbourne, once a whip of the Whig Party, Prime Minister of Britain in the 1930s and 1940s, and also a teacher of Queen Victoria. Chapter 13, Foreign Secretary Palmerston. I didn't know which beautiful princess insisted on dismissing her teacher, but now she's complaining about me. Albert, who was full of love in his eyes, hugged Victoria with his left hand and gently stroked Victoria with his right hand. The golden hair said in a loving tone, "I don't care. Everything is your fault." The 29-year-old Victoria still smacked her lips like a child and acted like a spoiled child to Albert. Even though the two have been together for 8 years, Victoria's feelings for Albert are the same as when they first met. In Victoria's eyes, Albert, who is the same age as her, is still so handsome. "That's right. It's my lifetime's fault to know you." Prince Albert pretended to be serious to Queen Victoria. Victoria's eyes widened. Her pale white arms that hooked around the back of Albert's neck tightened slightly, as if you were going to try again. However, Albert's next sentence made Victoria smile. "Merciful God has given me the honor to know you. Since I have made a mistake, let God make the two of us wrong forever. I mistakenly pulled the angel into the mortal world, and then brazenly wooed the angel. Albert A. worthy of being a proud graduate of the University of Bonn." A set of playful love words made Victoria smile. The lips collided with each other, and there was a strong love. After the kiss, the spark of love became more intense. "Victoria, Albert felt his breath hot. Not only breathing, but even the whole body became hot. The flame in Victoria's eyes was even hotter, as if it would burn everything up. The setting sun outside the window shone on the walls of Buckingham Palace and pulled out a long day-long reflection. making the originally splendid arches especially sacred under the sunlight, and a spring breeze filled the sacred room. Listen to a certain room in Buckingham Palace. You will hear gasps mixed with suppressed moans. The strong spring feeling lasted for half an hour and ended point the sun sets and night falls. John Brown, who was in charge of taking care of the daily life of the Victoria couple, came to the door of the room lightly and knocked softly. "Your Highness, Your Majesty, the banquet will start in 2 hours. Now it's time to wash up." "Yeah." Victoria's lazy voice came from the room. The faint sound of flint ignition sounded, and the dark room was lit. John Brown, who saw the light in the room through the crack of the door, quickly gathered the maids who were in charge of the Victoria couple's daily life, and waited for a message from inside. Nearly 20 minutes later, Albert's strong voice came from the room. "You can come in now." The door of the room opened, and the maids, holding the toiletries and necessary cosmetics, swarmed up. Victoria and Albert were manipulated like two dolls to be manipulated. The bright red military uniform was worn on Albert's body, and the gorgeous purple lace dress was placed on Victoria's body. "My dear, I think we two are like two dolls." Victoria, who hated complicated etiquette and attire, complained to Albert, "Your Majesty, you are the ruler of the whole of Britain. The complicated etiquette is conducive to maintaining the respect of your subjects for you. If you are disheveled, I'm afraid that Prime Minister Russell will criticize me behind my back." Albert, half joking and half serious, responded, "He dares." Victoria looked like a blown up she-cat. "If he does this, I'll have to remove his prime minister." In the 19th century, when the kingship was not yet weak, the power of the king/emperor was above all secular rules. Even in Britain, which claims to be a constitutional monarchy, as long as Queen Victoria wants to, she can completely abolish the cabinet, and even if she only needs a hint, those opposition parties will charge for the Queen. The so-called, as long as the cabinet agrees. Even if the Queen is executed, she can only sign the voting paper is impossible. The maid standing by the side didn't seem to hear Victoria's arrogant words and still worked diligently. From the first day she stayed at Buckingham Palace, she was told that people who are not strict with their mouths will always shut up in Buckingham Palace. Every year, people disappear in Buckingham Palace, and they are all talkative people without exception. "Victoria, I told you long ago, rights are not for profligacy, and the rights of the Kingdom of Great Britain are based on the Magna Carta. You don't need to do it yourself if you want to bring down a cabinet, Prince Albert Zuxu." It's like Queen Victoria talking about the magic of doing nothing. It took about an hour to groom and organize. The dressed Queen Victoria and her husband were led by attendants and John Brown to the side hall of Buckingham Palace. Reading www.whoacan'tyou.com. They are here to receive Palmerston, the British Foreign Minister, and his wife. A carriage slowly drove Buckingham Palace from the dark night. Inside the carriage sat a man with an oval face, a high nose bridge, and thick lips. He was wearing a long black flak cashmere coat with a large medal hanging on his chest and a pair of black silk tights. Although his temples and white face were also covered with a line of wrinkles, this did not affect his wisdom at all. A pair of deep and wise eyes seemed to see the essence of everything. He was the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Kingdom of Great Britain, also known as the Palmerston of Foreign Secretary. On his body is a young woman who is far from his age. This young woman, who looks only in her 40s and has a charming face, is actually 61 years old, and the years only leave her face. The scratches from a few years did not affect the old woman's overall appearance at all. She leaned quietly beside Palmerston. Although the age difference is not far, it presents a harmonious scene of old husband and young wife. The old woman is his wife and the widow of Earl Cowper. It has been 9 years since Palmerston married her. During these 9 years, the two still maintain the passion that only young people have. Henry Palmerston's full name is Henry John Temple Palmerston. "What do you think the Queen and her husband invited us to Buckingham Palace for?" The swaying kerosene hanging in the carriage, Mrs. Palmerston asked her husband in front of her as the lamp shone. "I think it's probably some work," Palmerston responded vaguely. Chapter 14. Visiting Buckingham Palace. Palmerston's vague response silenced his wife, who had been in love with Palmerston for 9 years, more on what they wanted, knowing the domineering and stubbornness of the man in front of him in politics, and never discussing politics with this man, has become a commandment in Mrs. Palmerston's heart. Facing the silent box and the slightly trembling carriage from time to time, Palmerston leaned against the back seat of the carriage, his eyes slowly closed, and he took a nap. Point for an old man who is over 60. Staying up late is really a physical injury, but he has to do the complicated diplomatic work and the call of Prince Albert, the one who gave the order is Queen Victoria, things to face. Palmerston had reason to believe that Queen Victoria would not hesitate to oust him once his work faced a mistake. At that time, I'm afraid that Prime Minister Russell will be the first to attack him. Thinking of the various strategies of Prime Minister Russell, Palmerston's closed eyes showed a subtle disdain. Prime Minister, he did not understand the root cause of the predicament in Britain at all. The 10-hour workday to deal with unemployment and the hasty establishment of the Public Security Health Committee to deal with cholera were all proposals that could cure headaches and pains. Although Palmerston's backstab against Prime Minister Russell has long been brewing in his heart, the current situation requires the Prime Minister, the unfortunate one, to carry the two major thunders of unemployment and strike. And barely maintain the political operation of the cabinet is the best solution. Palmerston thought about the questions that Prince Albert might ask, and how to deal with the difficulties that Queen Victoria might come. The accident in 1839 made the Queen disgust herself. Note 1. Under non-essential conditions, Palmerston had more contact with Prince Albert. The Queen was always guided by her own emotions and lost. Politicians should have the bearing. Wang Fu is a qualified politician. The carriage walked slowly in James Park for nearly 5 minutes to its destination. The carriage slowly parked in the open-air parking lot in front of Buckingham Palace, and the driver in charge of the carriage rushed to Palmerston in the carriage and called out respectfully, "Viscount." Note 2. "We are here." Palmerston opened his eyes and helped his wife push open the carriage door. At this time, a servant wearing a kilt rushed out of Buckingham Palace, and he was John Brown. "Mr. Brown." Palmerston's slightly raised head nodded like a dragonfly. Speaking the traditional Scottish Gaelic language. As the foreign minister, he knew that the vulgar guy in front of him was Prince Albert's confidant servant, and it would still be beneficial for him to release some kindness to the servants around Albert's palace. Just as Palmerston expected, John Brown's body trembled slightly after hearing Palmerston greet him cordially in his native dialect. Since he served as Prince Albert's housekeeper, he has not heard the hometown dialect for a long time. The goodwill towards Palmerston also rose after Palmerston said his hometown dialect. "Viscount Palmerston, the Queen and her husband are waiting for you in the dining room." Unlike the arrogance of Dr. James, John Brown showed due respect for Palmerston, a political figure. How are the feelings of the Queen and the husband? Palmerston tried to judge what kind of destiny he was going to face today, based on the feelings of the husband and the Queen. The Queen and her husband are both in a good mood. John Brown's words were like a reassurance that half of Palmerston's worries were removed. Under the leadership of John Brown, Palmerston came to the main hall of the Buckingham Palace restaurant. The chandelier on the ceiling of the main hall illuminates the entire main hall. Below the chandelier is a long dining table made of nanmu. The dining table is covered with a layer of light yellow tablecloth. Beautifully patterned china plate. The china plate is a pair of silver-plated tabloirs. Under the light of the ceiling chandelier, it shimmers with a silver light with closed eyes. Under the silver-plated tabloir is a white silk handkerchief. A handkerchief can be used to clean the residue from the mouth after dinner, and there is a gilded candle holder with 3 candles lit next to the cutlery. The whole banquet revealed a look of macup and a luxurious aura, and the cost of the arrangement in front of it was enough to make more than 10 families in Britain, and a family of 4, eat bread for a year. And these arrangements are just some insignificant embellishments. As the ruler of a huge empire, these embellishments are also essential. As usual, Queen Victoria wore a luxurious court dress and sat in the center of the long dining table. Prince Albert also wore a big red military uniform and a medal on his chest, sitting opposite Queen Victoria. Reading www.canchu.com. Your Majesty, Your Highness. Palmerston and his wife, who entered the restaurant, saluted Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. "Minister Palmerston, you are here." Prince Albert, who was in a good mood, smiled and said to Palmerston. Queen Victoria didn't say anything but nodded, looking like she was still angry at Palmerston's rude behavior. "Don't be restrained. Please take a seat." Prince Albert invited the Palmerston couple to take a seat. Although the protagonist named in this banquet is Queen Victoria, Palmerston understands that the real protagonist is Prince Albert. Palmerston did not sit on Queen Victoria's side, but on the left of Prince Albert, while his wife sat next to Queen Victoria. When everything was ready, Prince Albert nodded to John Brown, who was standing at the door. John Brown, who understood what the prince meant, brought out a tray with a bell on it. John Brown gently shook the bell. 2 dining trolleys were pushed to the dining room of Buckingham Palace. Caviar from the Russian Empire, foie gras and snails from France, and small pieces of sirloin are in front of them. P.S. 1. Palmerston married his wife in 1839. In the same year, because he could not control his waistband and had an affair with the maid of Windsor Castle, the pregnant queen was very annoyed when she found out and said that she must give Palmerston his beautiful too. Palmerston was awarded the title of Viscount. Before the universal suffrage law was implemented, the right to vote for the British who depended on the tax payment was still in the hands of the nobles of the House of Lords. If the majority of the House of Lords did not agree, the cabinet would collapse. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 15. Thrilling Meal. After all the dishes were served, John Brown reappeared in the restaurant, this time holding a tan unopened bottle of sherry. Would you like a glass of sherry? Prince Albert asked Palmerston in a brisk tone. Palmerston pretended to be flattered and agreed to Albert, but he kept telling himself that he must not lose his words. After drinking. Compared with Queen Victoria, who had no scheme, Palmerston was more frightened of Prince Albert. This top student from Germany seems to be born for the British system. Palmerston does not see a trace of the frivolity that a nobleman should have in him. A knife in your back. Albert motioned John Brown to open the cork, and with a pop, John Brown opened the wine from the town of Jerez, Spain, which had been sealed for more than 200 years. Another servant appeared in the restaurant with a tray containing 4 crystal cups. Each crystal cup had 2 cubes of ice cubes in the shape of sugar cubes. With a hazy hoarfrost, John Brown carefully poured the sherry into the crystal glass, and a crashing dark yellow hot liquid like beer poured into the crystal glass, covering the white wall of the glass. The frost disappeared, and ice cubes floated above the crystal glass. After the 4 glasses of sherry with ice were made in the hands of John Brown, the 4 servants entered the dining room and placed the sherry in front of Prince Albert, Palmerston and others. The 4 servants left, and John Brown also saluted everyone present, carefully half-closed the door of the restaurant, and stayed outside the restaurant to wait for Albert's summons. Cheers to Britain. Albert raised his cup and turned his eyes to Palmerston, and Queen Victoria also turned to Palmerston's wife. Palmerston immediately raised the glass with a flattered expression and said, "Cheers to the Queen and Prince." So did Mrs. Palmerston. The warmth of the sherry, combined with the coolness of the ice, traveled down Palmerston's throat to his stomach, and Palmerston felt a little drunk. After half a glass of wine, Prince Albert didn't say anything. He lightly picked up the aluminum-plated knife and cut a piece of beef loin into his mouth. Seeing that Albert didn't say anything, Palmerston also cut off the sirloin and chewed it finely. It was not until the second sip of sherry that Prince Albert entered the topic. "Palmerston, what do you think of the recent series of events in Britain?" Palmerston immediately put down the knife and fork in his hand, picked up the tablecloth, and wiped his face. After thinking for a moment, he pushed and said, "His Royal Highness, Prime Minister Russell is in charge of Britain's internal affairs. He must know better than me." Albert, who saw Palmerston playing football, had no other choice but to scold Old Fox in his heart. Albert was unwilling to believe that Palmerston, who was committed to the premiership, really did not understand that the outside world was rumored to be rumored. The uproar of the charter movement is mostly unwilling to get involved in this matter. Albert, who scolded Palmerston inwardly, still had a kind smile on his face and said, "Can you tell me what happened in Continental recently, as the foreign minister? Understand what happened in Continental, and properly handle Britain and the United Kingdom. The relationship with the country should be your responsibility." "Your Highness, I don't know which part you want to listen to," Palmerston asked. For some reason, Albert suddenly remembered what Dr. James said to him this afternoon, and he immediately said, "Let's talk about our old neighbor France first. After all, the birthplace of this revolution came from that country." Palmerston pondered for a moment and reorganized the language in his mind. During the February riots, the people of Paris drove their king out of the palace. The whole country has presented the worst side. Those Republicans and mountain parties are struggling to maintain a republic. So, the riots in France won't affect Britain? Albert continued. The fear of the Great Revolution had penetrated deep into the bones of European monarchs. In order to make people fear the revolution, they even demonized everything about the Great Revolution. Palmerston replied after combining the changes from the British ambassador to France and the overall change in Europe. From the current situation, this riot is different from the one decades ago, and the French political situation does not have a decisive force. Twist France together. The former dynastic deputies remain where they were. That's right. Prince Albert nodded and asked again, which force in France, do you think, will win the final victory? Can the Bourbon dynasty return? You read www.urkanshu.com. Palmerston shook his head and responded worriedly, in terms of Britain's interests, a dynasty is always better than a republic, but judging from the existing information, the future of France is likely to be in the hands of those republics. Didn't you say that those congressmen are still in their original positions? Asked Albert, who lacked doubts about the French intelligence. His Royal Highness, the Bourbon dynasty has been around for 33 years, since its inception in 1815. The people of Paris have already hated Bourbon. The Paris mob itself is a nation that loves the new and hates the old. Palmerston added, although in our eyes two Bourbons have the same origin and different branches, but in the eyes of the Parisian mob, the French power is only from one Bourbon to another. Palmerston, in April, could not have imagined that the June Revolution 2 months later would push the Republicans who had secured the victory directly into the abyss of defeat. If it's the Bonaparte family, Prince Albert asked tentatively. There was a flash of surprise in Palmerston's eyes. He had also heard some rumors about Prince Albert's contact with the Bonaparte family. Now it seems that some of the rumors are not groundless. Your Highness, with all due respect, Palmerston said bluntly, the Bonaparte family has been out of politics for more than 30 years, and its influence has long since disappeared with the disappearance of the empire. A party without influence it's hard to make a difference in French politics. Afterwards, Palmerston changed the subject. Of course I'm just saying that in general. Who knows that the French political scene is changing rapidly, and there may be a miracle. Appropriate investment is still necessary. An empire is far better than an empire. The republic is better. Chapter 16. The diplomatic dilemma of the new republic. Palmerston's analysis based on the IC diplomatic level was indeed a big blow to Albert, but it did not mean that he had to give up the plan brewing in his heart. As Palmerston said, an empire, no matter how bad, is better than a republic. Who knows if the ruler of the republic on the other side of the ocean will once again rescind his previous promise to the European countries not to launch a revolution. The not very glorious meeting in 1815 was an eternal pain in their hearts. Core interest of the United Kingdom lies in the stability of Europe, and at the same time there is a certain confrontation, so that the United Kingdom can better maintain its presence in the European continent. Prince Albert picked up the aluminized steel fork to take the French snail out of the shell, and said casually, "Did the ambassador to France find you?" Albert's casual inquiry really made Palmerston's relaxed spirit tense again, and his forehead couldn't help but feel a little cool. The ambassador to France of the new French Republic did look for him, but the meeting between the two took place in private, so the husband should not know about it. The keen sense of smell from politicians told Palmerston that Prince Albert's inquiry was just an accident, but if he guessed wrong, Palmerston, who was thinking for a moment in his mind, immediately admitted, the ambassador to France and I have indeed met in private. Then, he added another sentence, but he not only met me, I heard that he also met the Iron Duke, Wellington, before I met. Note 1. Albert's face did not show surprise. He nodded indifferently and said, I have heard about the fact that France sent a special envoy to see the Duke of Iron. But, Prince Albert paused, turned his eyes to Palmerston with a meaningful smile and said, the ambassador to France seems to have overstepped the diplomacy itself. by meeting the foreign minister in private. Of course, the royal family has no right to interfere in the affairs of the cabinet. After Queen Victoria, who was sitting on the other side of Albert, heard Albert's voice, she also put down her knife and fork and looked at Viscount Palmerston. Even Palmerston, the foreign secretary, felt a little flustered under the warning words of the king and the queen's gaze. The royal family has no right to interfere with the cabinet, but the royal family has the right to influence the cabinet. For Palmerston, every sentence that follows is a major event affecting his career, and he must respond more cautiously. His Royal Highness, the ambassador to France, hopes that the United Kingdom can recognize the French Republic. Palmerston decisively informed Albert of what happened that day. Then, Viscount, what's your opinion? Prince Albert looked at Palmerston and said at a leisurely pace, I think the United Kingdom should be more cautious. We should neither recognize nor oppose it, referring to the French Republic. Palmerston replied carefully. Albert, who heard Palmerston's response, neither agreed nor objected. He picked up the steel fork and tapped the snail's shell lightly, as if to say to himself, a shell with a solid appearance, in fact, only needs some external forces can break through. Our neighbors also need some external forces to change. A republic that has been under a vigorous revolution is not liked by Europe. Palmerston immediately understood what Albert meant, and he expressed sympathy for Lamartine, the head of the republic on the other side. That's right. Prince Albert said, Mr. Viscount, do you know Jerome Bonaparte? Palmerston froze for a moment and replied, Your Highness, are you talking about Napoleon's younger brother, Jerome Bonaparte? No. Prince Albert shook his head and said, I'm talking about Jerome Bonaparte's son. Sorry, I don't know anything about the younger generation of the Bonaparte family. Palmerston kept Jerome Bonaparte in his heart. If nothing else, this guy will be active in politics as the new generation leader of the Bonaparte family. Prince Albert whispered softly, the Bonaparte family's blood is really inseparable from politics. Your Highness, does the Foreign Office of the United Kingdom? Palmerston immediately understood Prince Albert's intention. Prince Albert shook his head slightly and responded, if the situation in France is really what you said, then no matter how much we push it, it won't help. This will cause the neighbors resentment, and a move of idle chess may sometimes yield unexpected results. No. Excessive attention is needed. Yes. Palmerston responded. Tell me about the situation in Russia. Are our European military police jumping up and down again to defend his exquisite toy? Albert said mockingly. After the Vienna Conference in 1815, you reading www.urkanshu. It has been more than 30 years since the Holy Alliance headed by the Russian Empire began to guard the European monarchical order, and the United Kingdom has also changed from original support to disgust. The greedy Slavs have eroded an unknown amount of land all the way under the coat of defending the Holy Alliance. The self-proclaimed European military police are indeed the things that Eastern European invaders did. The Holy Alliance really needs to change. Since the Austrian and Prussian revolutions occurred in succession, the Russian ambassador to Britain has always conveyed Nicolai's orders. Palmerston dispatched troops from the Russian Empire after the February Revolution, intending to control Walla, while interfering in the revolution. News from the Principality of Guinea informed Prince Albert. It seems that Tsar Nicholas is still immersed in his fantasy. Prince Albert said calmly, it seems that the European gatekeepers can no longer stop him. Yes. Palmerston sighed inwardly. The former Ottoman Empire has grown old, and it seems that no country in the Near East can stop it. But Britain was not ready for war with the Russian Empire. We need a friend who can contain a certain country, even if this friend has done something. Prince Albert said implicitly. Palmerston immediately understood, and the two smiled at each other, and did not speak for a long time. P.S. 1. After the February Revolution of 1848, Lamartine, who served as the interim head of the Second Republic, first issued a report to European countries, promising that France would recognize the established facts of the Vienna Conference in 1815, and sent a special envoy to the United Kingdom in April. The Duke of Wellington conveyed goodwill, and hoped that the United Kingdom would recognize the nascent republic. Chapter 17. The Death of Louis Napoleon, Part 1. No one knows what was said at the banquet, and historians can only infer from the clues and historical events found in the few words in Victoria's diary that the meeting of Palmerston and Prince Albert may be one of the later generations. The beginning of a series of major events, and the protagonists of the big event are not only Prince Albert and Palmerston. It will be like a vortex that completely envelops the whole of Europe. Time flies. The sun and the moon are like shuttles in the blink of an eye. It was April 30th, and it was a dark day. In the early morning, thick overcast clouds shrouded the entire city of London. From time to time in the dark clouds, a light blue electric arc could be seen passing through the clouds to illuminate London, followed by a deafening sound of thunder. A torrential rain seems to be coming to London soon. At this point, half a month has passed since Jerome arrived in London. During these 7 days, Dr. Jerome and James tried every means to maintain Napoleon III's fragile life like a firefly. From intravenous injection to enemas, to taking opium. Opium can effectively relieve pain, and was the most effective anesthetic and sedative in the 19th century. However, patients taking opium inevitably become addicts. The United Kingdom, an opium powerhouse, also has the largest number of addicts in all of Europe. Of course, smoking opium also makes a huge contribution to the taxation of the United Kingdom in some ways. In short, Dr. Jerome and James used all the cholera treatment methods that they knew, or that son could use in the medical field, on Louis Napoleon, but Louis Napoleon's body was still getting worse day by day. The inevitable failure of organs made Louis Napoleon a luxury even to breathe, and the unextracted salicylic acid could no longer suppress the high fever caused by cholera. Under the double torture of high fever and organ failure, Louis Bonaparte's body is getting worse day by day. In just half a month, Louis Napoleon's arm has been thin to the point of being skinny, and his abdomen is slightly watery. The clear eyes that once seemed to be able to see through everything also became cloudy. Kill me. God, save your child. Louis Napoleon, who was under double torture, wailed in pain. This hard-hitting man, who had experienced a hail of bullets in Italy, couldn't bear the pain. It will be fine. Louis, it will be fine. Miss Howard, who was sitting beside Louis Napoleon, clasped her hands and made a gesture of prayer, soothing Louis Napoleon with tears in her eyes. Miss Howard's consolation did not calm Louis Napoleon. He still groaned in pain. Kill me. I don't want to go on like this. Kill me. Seeing this, Howard could only keep shaking his head. How could she, a weak woman, commit murder? Seeing that, Louis Napoleon, who could not beg Howard to end his life, turned to Jerome Bonaparte, who was making salicylic acid. Lying on the bed, Louis Napoleon called Jerome Bonaparte in an almost pleading voice. Cousin, my dear cousin, come here. Jerome Bonaparte turned to look at Louis Napoleon, with a trace of pity and intolerance in his eyes. Rather than letting Louis Napoleon suffer from illness, it is better to let him die. But Jerome Bonaparte was also unable to bear the charge of homicide. The most important thing was that his cousin was the leader of the Bonaparte family. The crime of killing the leader is a serious crime that Jerome cannot bear. If it was discovered that Jerome helped Louis Napoleon to be completely freed, those guys in France would definitely not mind pouring sewage on him. At that time, those illegitimate sons wandering on the periphery of the Bonaparte family and the opponents within the Bonaparte family, the opponents are mainly Napoleon's eldest brother Joseph, will definitely show up. Not to mention becoming the president. If they don't make trouble, they will send Jerome to prison in Strasbourg by transnational law enforcement. Cousin. Jerome slowly came to Louis Napoleon and whispered in Louis Napoleon's ear, I know you are in pain. I also understand that you want to be relieved, but I can't bear this crime. So for the Bonaparte family, Jerome was not talking. At this moment, he felt a little disgusted that he had forcibly tied the honor of the Bonaparte family to a seriously ill patient, euphemistically calling it for the Bonaparte family. After hearing Jerome Bonaparte's muttering, Louis Napoleon suppressed his wailing and slowly spit out the words for Bonaparte. Until now, Louis Napoleon still did not give up the dream of the Bonaparte family to regain the throne of the highest power in France. Even if he fails to ascend to the throne, reading www.whocan'tyou.com, he will also be watching this underground cousin who has followed him all the way to the throne. Thinking of this, Louis Napoleon stretched out his trembling hand to give Jerome Bonaparte encouragement. When his hand was less than a thumb width away from Jerome Bonaparte's shoulder, Louis Napoleon slowly withdrew his hand. He did not want to pass his disease to Jerome. Jerome Bonaparte returned to the table, where the salicylic acid was being prepared again with tears in her eyes. Time slowly pointed to 10 o'clock, and Dr. James reappeared in Louis Napoleon's hospital bed. After routinely checking Louis Napoleon's physical condition, Dr. James called Jerome Bonaparte out. According to the information I have learned, Prince Louis may not live for 2 days now. I hope you are prepared. Dr. James's words were like a boulder smashed into Jerome's heart. After being silent for a long time, Jerome exhaled a breath and forced a smile. That's fine. Cousin, he doesn't have to suffer so much. Looking at his pained waiting, sometimes I really want to help him. If Dr. James emphasized again, if Prince Louis tragically passes away today, Your Excellency had better cremate the prince's body as soon as possible. I have seen many people who were infected with cholera because they wanted to preserve their remains. It's gone. Jerome nodded to show his understanding. After the two chatted with the prince again, Dr. James left. As of now, there is no worthy treatment plan. On the night of May and August 1848, the heavy rain that had been brewing for a long time poured down like a signal, and the life of Louis Napoleon, Napoleon III, was about to come to an end. Chapter 18, The Death of Louis Napoleon, Part 2. My dear cousin, the revival of the Bonaparte family is up to you, perhaps. It was the reflection of the light. When he was dying, Louis Napoleon's voice miraculously ceased to be hoarse, and his pale and sluggish face recovered a little bit of energy. Cousin. Jerome Bonaparte looked at the recovered Louis Napoleon and already vaguely knew in his heart that this might be his last moment. Cousin, call Pessigny and the others. I have something to tell them. After saying this, Louis Napoleon wilted like a deflated balloon, and a violent cough came out of Louis Napoleon's mouth again. Seeing this, Jerome quickly trotted to the first floor downstairs. Pessigny, Fleury, and others sat on the sofa on the first floor, as if they had received some spiritual suggestion. Some of them frowned, some folded their hands. In short, their mood was closely linked to the physical condition of Louis Napoleon on the second floor, but they did not dare to face the seriously ill Louis Napoleon. To be precise, they did not dare to face themselves in particular. Pessigny, who has been by Louis Napoleon's side for more than 10 years, pinned his dreams, hopes and everything on Louis Napoleon. He firmly believed that Louis Bonaparte would definitely become the ruler of France, and now Louis Napoleon is about to face death, and his dream is very likely to be annihilated with the death beside Louis Napoleon. Pessigny's mind was completely blank, and he no longer wanted to hear any unfavorable news. Jerome's downstairs brought the last thing Pessigny didn't want to face in front of him. Almost all eyes were on Jerome, with despair and pleading in their eyes. Jerome's heart is also a little heavy. The dim kerosene light shines on his face, that looks like an emperor, Emperor Napoleon, which adds a touch of holiness. His sad face and firm eyes are very similar to those after the Battle of Waterloo. Emperor. Pessigny opened his mouth and almost called out the word Your Majesty. After careful observation, he realized that Jerome's face was very different from the emperor's, so he quickly changed his words and said, Prince, Your Highness, Your Majesty's body. Pessigny didn't dare to ask further questions, and was waiting for Jerome's reply with 2 points of confusion, 3 points of anxiety and 5 points of unease. Your Majesty, Jerome said with difficulty, let you all come over. The mood of Pessigny and the others was as if they had fallen into the abyss, and their last hope was also shattered. The emperor still couldn't wait for a miracle. Pessigny opened his mouth to say something, but couldn't say a word. Talon's tears streamed in her eyes. You are the emperor's most loyal friends and partners, so Jerome Bonaparte said to Tyrann and the others with a low moan. Go up. Jerome walked to the front of the line, followed by Pessigny, Fleury, Tyrann and others. Originally it only took less than 1 minute to complete the trip, but Pessigny and others walked for a full 2 minutes. When Jerome Bonaparte opened the room, everyone saw the gesture of the monarch/prince they were loyal to. The servant who was in charge of taking care of Louis Napoleon's daily life couldn't help sobbing softly. And Fleury, an Iron Man who had experienced fighting in Algeria, also snorted slightly. Come in, came Louis Napoleon's weak and hoarse voice. Everyone enters the room. This may be Louis Napoleon's last order. Persigny. Louis Napoleon called out to Persigny first. Your Majesty, I'm here. Persigny said with a weeping voice. Persigny, cough, my friend. Louis Napoleon coughed and said to Persigny, you fought with me. We fought to subvert the dynasty together, went to prison together. I thought we will ascend to the throne of France together, and now it seems that God does not love me. Your Majesty, you will be fine. I promise God. Persigny's voice became even more choked. After decades of following, he and Louis Napoleon have become not only monarchs and attendants, but more like them. A pair of friends. Persigny was reluctant to accept the death of Louis Napoleon. Persigny, don't comfort me anymore. I know my physical condition. When I'm dying, I hope you can promise me a condition. Louis Napoleon's voice gradually weakened, and his breath gradually became faster. This is my plea to you as a friend. Your Majesty, your will is my direction. Persigny said to Louis Napoleon obediently. I hope you can help my cousin take France's rights. This is my only plea to you as your friend. As the Louis Bonaparte Group, who is second only to Louis Napoleon, Persigny holds the biggest voice besides Louis Bonaparte, and is also the candidate to connect the hidden Bonapartists in France. You reading www.urkanshu.com. If Persigny was unwilling to assist Jerome would have to spend a lot of effort to reintegrate Louis Napoleon's forces. Of course, Persigny could only continue to follow in Bonaparte's footsteps. Looking at the dying Louis Napoleon, Persigny's heart is full of gratitude. The Louis Napoleon cabal will not dissipate. Because of Louis Napoleon's death, they will allegiance to the new monarch until he ascends the throne of France. Your Majesty's will is my direction. Persigny reiterated. Louis Napoleon smiled with satisfaction. Next, Louis Napoleon had a few words with everyone present. Jerome, come here. I have something to tell you. Louis Napoleon's voice was so weak that he couldn't hear it unless he listened carefully. Jerome came to the head of Louis Napoleon's bed. His right ear was close to the profile of Louis Napoleon's face. Remember, you must get the approval of the United Kingdom. Remember my agreement with them. I see. Jerome Bonaparte pursed his lips. To show his understanding. Louis Napoleon lay down and slowly closed his eyes, as if he had exhausted all his strength. In the dimness, he seemed to see that he became the president of the Second Republic, and then became the emperor of the empire through a coup. He was introduced to marry a young lady from Spain, and gave birth to his first legitimate son. He won the Russian Empire that his uncle didn't win back then. But he didn't find the shadow of his cousin in his dream. This ending seems to be good too. Louis Napoleon died at 02 on May 1st, 1848, at the age of 40. Chapter 19, God Movement. Except for Jerome Bonaparte, no one would know that the sudden death of Louis Napoleon made the whole of Europe begin to move along the original historical line. Jerome realized that he had to be more careful with every move. The pillar of Bonaparte's family died prematurely, and he had to become a new pillar to support the followers of Bonaparte. Looking at the corpse of his cousin lying motionless on the bed, Jerome immediately gave the first order. Persigny. Yes. Persigny responded immediately. My cousin's corpse can't exist for too long, so can I cremate my cousin's corpse? Jerome Bonaparte asked Persigny. As soon as these words came out, the expressions of everyone present changed a little. Persigny's expression was a little stiff. Miss Howard, who burst into tears, accused Jerome with anger. You want to burn your cousin's body before it's cold. Facing Howard's angry accusations, Jerome Bonaparte realized that there is no tradition of cremation in Europe. Catholics even believe that cremation is disrespectful to the corpse, and it is a despicable act that prevents the corpse from completing the resurrection. Even the United Kingdom, headed by the Anglican Church, was only cremated in glory at the end of the 19th century. In 1848, European countries were reluctant to cremate dead bodies. I was negligent. Jerome, who was still thinking in modern society, glanced at the resentful Miss Howard, and then glanced at the Bonapartists with different expressions, and resolutely admitted his mistakes. Only then did the expressions of Miss Howard and the Bonapartists improve. Since cremation was not feasible, Jerome considered embalming his cousin's body to some extent. The technology of embalming has become a mature process from Egypt thousands of years ago. The uncle of Jerome, Louis Napoleon, called his uncle Emperor Napoleon, was embalmed after his death, and then 4 people to visit. It was said that he seemed to have been cut with a knife, and Jerome held a moment of silence in his heart for his unmasked uncle. Persigny obeyed Jerome Bonaparte's order and was ready to find a qualified embalming master at dawn the next day. "Where are you taking Louis?" The wise Miss Howard soon realized Jerome Bonaparte's plan. Jerome Bonaparte said with a tragic tone, "Cousin is going back to France. That is his home. He is a hero of the French Republic, and a hero should be enshrined in the Invalides." Hero? Invalides? Miss Howard didn't know what Jerome wanted to do, but the woman's sixth sense reminded her that the guy in front of her seemed to want to make a fuss about Louis' corpse. But she is only Louis Napoleon's lover, and has no right to prevent Jerome Bonaparte, a worthy relative, from making a decision. After a short period of time regarding the handling of the cousin's body, Jerome Bonaparte smiled and said to everyone present, "Everyone has been tired for several days. Go back and rest first. I'll just watch over here." Persigny and others insisted that they also guard the body of Louis Napoleon, but Jerome Bonaparte could only agree to their request. Everyone worked together to take off Louis Napoleon's clothes and put on his favorite military uniform from the First Empire period. This military uniform was the one he wore when he launched the coup in Boulogne. By the way, he helped Louis Napoleon wipe his body, covered him with the tricolor cloth symbolizing the French flag, embroidered on the cloth with a flying eagle. This is the national flag that Louis Napoleon dreamed of hanging over France, and now it can only be covered on himself. Having done all this, Jerome and the others stood around Louis Napoleon quietly watching the flag covering Napoleon. On this day, no one rested in Louis Napoleon's mansion. The rainstorm stopped around 5 o'clock, and the dark clouds shrouded in downtown London were blown to other places by the strong wind. At 7 AM on May 9th, the eastern sky finally turned white, the fiery red sun rose slowly, and the sun shined on Louis Napoleon's body through the glass. Seeing this, Persigny hurriedly closed the curtains, and the sunlight could only reach the bedside through the curtains. Time passed again to 9 AM, and the number of gentlemen on the street gradually increased. They wore top hats and walked leisurely on St. James Street with a cane made of unknown wood in their hands. Persigny is also ready to set off to find a famous embalming master in the London area. This time, it is Tyrone who follows Persigny to drive the carriage. Just after Persigny and Tyrone left, Dr. James came to ask about Louis Napoleon as usual. The moment he pushed open the door, you read www.whocan'tyou.com, he saw the national flag covering the body of Louis Napoleon, as well as the sad faces of Jerome. Dr. James came to Jerome Bonaparte with a serious face and said some words of comfort to Jerome. Jerome Bonaparte also expressed his gratitude to Dr. James for his presence. "I'm just doing my job faithfully. Besides, your cousin's illness hasn't gotten better because of my treatment. Speaking of which, I'm ashamed to be a doctor. The dissipation of life, or the dissipation of money?" Dr. James sighed and asked Jerome about his plans. Jerome told him sincerely that he would bring his cousin back to France and participate in the French elections. Hearing that he wanted the answer, Dr. James comforted Jerome again and left in a hurry. Looking at the background, where Dr. James left in a hurry, Jerome showed a successful smile on his face. On the other hand, Persigny and Tyrone also invited the best embalming experts in London. After the two sides negotiated a price of £100, the doctor began to work on Louis Napoleon's body. Jerome and the others did not gather in the room, but left and went downstairs, leaving Fleury alone to supervise the progress. Not long after, a gorgeous carriage stopped in front of Louis Napoleon's mansion. John Brown, the steward of the United Kingdom's royal family, got off the carriage and knocked on the door of the mansion. Persigny, who was in charge of opening the door, was extremely surprised when he saw John Brown. The arrival of the British royal family was something he never expected. "Hello, Earl Persigny." John Brown saluted Persigny. "Hello, Steward Brown." Persigny nodded and lowered his eyebrows, a smile on his melancholy face. Chapter 20, The Times, Part 1. After Count Persigny brought John Brown into the mansion, Jerome Bonaparte also noticed this guy in exotic clothes. John Brown was wearing Scottish lace, which is really a bit hot. "His Royal Highness, this is Mr. John Brown, the housekeeper from Windsor Castle." After introducing John Brown to Jerome, Persimmon added, "A month ago, I called on your majesty." Yeah. A month ago, Prince Louis was still so healthy. Who knows that he will pass away a month later? It is really unpredictable. John Brown wiped the corner of his eyes without tears, pretending to be distraught, said like. Jerome Bonaparte looked at John Brown carefully. In his expectation, the action of the royal family should not be submitted to the cabinet in advance and then discussed by the cabinet before making contact. Why is the speed of the royal family of Windsor Castle so fast? Unless Jerome Bonaparte suddenly thought of a possibility, that is, the royal family of the United Kingdom did not directly contact him through the cabinet. Jerome breathed a relief of relief while feeling sorry in his heart. If it is the official intervention of the United Kingdom, it is very likely that it will cause some unnecessary embarrassment to both parties. Compared with the help of the United Kingdom, Jerome is more afraid of the French government to ban him. Although the royalists in Paris have thwarted Lamartine's nomination answer that the French royal family cannot participate in the election, it must not be difficult for Lamartine to use his power to target a certain person. And the private acceptance of the royal family, and the royal family will not leave any control. Thanks to Queen Victoria and Prince Albert for their concern. The Bonaparte family will definitely keep in mind what the United Kingdom can do to the Bonaparte family. Jerome said to John Brown with a rigid and formulaic official thank you. Since my cousin has reached some conditions with them, he will not break his promise. Sure enough, John Brown immediately asked Jerome, "His Excellency Prince Louis must have said something to you." "My cousin told me everything at the last moment of his life." Jerome Bonaparte nodded and said, "Since that's the case, I don't need to say more about the rest. The husband's conditions have not changed. I hope that you, Prince Jerome, will inherit the legacy of Prince Louis and stop the revolution. Only then will the conditions with Her Majesty take effect. I want to, that's all I have to say." So disturbing. John Brown bowed to Jerome Bonaparte, turned around and was about to leave. "Wait." Jerome Bonaparte stopped John Brown. "Your Highness, is there anything I can help?" John Brown asked Jerome Bonaparte. "That's right. I want to borrow Her Majesty's carriage." "I don't know. Mr. Brown can fulfill my request," said Jerome Bonaparte, pointing to the badge that John Brown had hung on his chest. "This?" John Brown hesitated. To be honest, he didn't have the right to borrow, but Prince Albert specifically instructed him to act cheaply when he was parting, and he could try his best to satisfy his not too excessive requirements. Jerome's borrowing a carriage is obviously a big deal and a small matter. Seeing John Brown's concerns, Jerome Bonaparte took the lead and said, "We just hope that Mr. John Brown can take me and Mr. Persimmon to the Times building, and that's all." "So that's what it is." John Brown immediately told Jerome that he must meet Jerome's conditions. Jerome once again instructed Tyrone that he must guard the mansion, and then got into John Brown's carriage with Persimmon. This time even John Brown was in the driver's seat. The carriage carrying Jerome and Persimmon started slowly. "Your Highness, what are we doing at the Times?" Persimmon asked Jerome in a low voice in the carriage. "You'll know when you arrive." Jerome did not answer Persimmon's question, but turned his eyes to the scenery outside the window. The carriage traveled a few blocks through the bustling neighborhoods and then came to the Times building. "His Royal Highness, we are here." John Brown in the driver's seat shouted at Jerome and the car. "Yeah." Jerome and the carriage responded slowly, but he didn't get off for a long time. The gentlemen near the Times building stopped when they saw the carriage symbolizing the British royal family. They were curious about who was sitting in the carriage. The carriage door slowly opened, and under the eyes of the British gentleman, Jerome and Persimmon slowly stepped out of the carriage. "It's him. I remember he was a butler beside Prince Louis. How could they sit in the royal carriage? Could it be Louis?" Napoleon's status in the French social circle was so extraordinary that the British gentleman knew Persimmon, who followed Louis Napoleon. Just as the British gentleman was guessing, Jerome thanked John Brown again and went straight to the Times building, unaware that John Brown, who was used by Jerome, returned to Windsor Castle. In the Times building, Jerome and Persimmon met their old acquaintance Forbeba. Note 1. The English translator of Fear's History of Governments and Empires met Jerome. Roman Persimmon showed a surprised expression and then laughed. "Mr. Persimmon, His Royal Highness, you are here. Mr. Forbes, we need your help." Jerome informed Forbes Ebel of the death of Louis Napoleon. Forbes Ebel's expression changed from surprise to astonishment, and with an apology on his face, he said to Jerome, "I'm very sorry. I didn't know the news of your cousin's death." Nothing. Jerome Bonaparte stepped into the topic. They wanted to publish the news of Louis Napoleon's death in the Times. With all due respect, it seems that the news of the deceased has been published rashly. Ebel had some concerns, and he was not sure whether Louis Napoleon was allowed to publish it. "Please, look at this." Having said that, Jerome Napoleon took out a folded manuscript. Ebel opened the manuscript, and the title of the manuscript was written with a striking title, From Bonaparte to Bonaparte, on the life of Louis Napoleon. This kind of powerful title quickly caught Ebel's attention, and Ebel, with years of editing experience, can be sure that, if the content is substantial, the article will be a big seller. P.S. 1. Forbes Ebel, the translator of the Times, who once handed over the annotation to Louis Napoleon for translation, and took Louis Napoleon to visit the Thames building. Chapter 21. The Times. Below. Ebel scrutinized the article in front of him with a critical eye. As one of Louis Napoleon's friends, Ebel felt sorry for Louis Napoleon's departure, so he had to guard the name behind Louis Napoleon. Today a disciple of Saint Simonianism, a senior Republican, a prince has left Usher's arrival, though like a shooting star across the sky, brought a new beginning. Just like Emperor Napoleon decades ago, history has proved that Prince Louis Napoleon's judgment on the July dynasty is undoubtedly correct, and the Sword of Austerlitz is undoubtedly a disaster in the hands of the Orleans government. Louis Napoleon once said that the sovereignty of the people means establishing the principle of equal rights for the people and the establishment of democratic organizations by merit, so that in the new social hierarchy, everyone has his own status, rights and responsibilities. Ebel wrote the entire manuscript. He glanced up and down quickly. The Sword of Austerlitz is the sword of Emperor Napoleon. When the dynasty welcomed back the body of Emperor Napoleon in July 1840, the sword was given to Louis Philippe as a trophy. This refers to the French regime. The whole article from top to bottom, in addition to expressing the praise of Napoleon and Napoleon III, also described Louis Napoleon as a republican who, although he was in the noble class, did not forget to worry about the country and the people, and turned to the republic, seeking happiness, but also expounding the political philosophy of Louis Napoleon. And, of course, regret for the inaction of the United Kingdom government during the economic crisis. His Royal Highness. Ebel put down the manuscript, turned his eyes to Jerome, and said with emotion, "Your writing skills and attainments are not inferior to Prince Louis at all." But Ebel changed the conversation, and said with a wry smile, "I'm afraid it's hard to get the chance to publish this article." "Why?" Pesini was stunned for a moment, and then retorted, "Didn't he the Times claim to have nothing to report?" Ebel spread his hands and responded helplessly, "Mr. Count, the situation is different now, and the Times also needs to be subject to the above constraints." Jerome Bonaparte instantly understood what Ebel meant. A newspaper with a circulation of 30,000 copies, like the Times, could not fail to receive attention from the United Kingdom government. A newspaper circulation of 30,000 is equivalent to 30,000 of the loyalists of the middle class who, together, can influence decision making across the United Kingdom. Not to mention that the Times has a loyal French readership overseas. At the juncture of the European Revolution in 1848, even the so-called democratic and free United Kingdom had to conduct limited censorship to ensure that some influential newspapers would not publish inflammatory articles or do some harm by manipulating public opinion. United Kingdom thing. Of course, except for the Polaris newspaper, which is favored by the British Charterists, will not stop their calls because of the censorship uniform of the United Kingdom, and the United Kingdom also dare not shut them down without any reason. Otherwise the British's freedom has become an empty talk. Of course we will not embarrass your newspaper. Jerome Bonaparte said politely to Ebel, "Mr. Ebel, please allow me to talk to your editor-in-chief." Seeing Jerome Bonaparte's confident appearance, Ebel had to introduce him into the office of the editor-in-chief in charge of the review on the second floor of the Times building. The arrival of Pesini surprised the editor-in-chief of the Audit. After hearing the news of the death of Louis Bonaparte, the editor-in-chief of the audit also showed a regretful expression. God loves Prince Louis so much that he made him early into heaven. Look at this. Ebel handed over the manuscript of From Bonaparte to Bonaparte on the life of Louis Bonaparte to the chief reviewing editor after the review editor who got the manuscript carefully reviewed the content of the manuscript. He put down the manuscript and shook his head. Sorry, the Times cannot publish such manuscripts now. Ebel gave Jerome Bonaparte and Pessinny a look at me and no look. Didn't the Times establish its influence in the United Kingdom with freedom of speech and the courage to speak the truth? When did it become the voice of the United Kingdom government? Jerome Bonaparte sneered. Or is the Times about to become the official lackey of the United Kingdom again? His Royal Highness, the editor-in-chief of the censor, clearly heard Jerome Bonaparte's innuendo. We are very helpless in this situation. During this time, the government has repeatedly asked us not to publish some articles on politics. Sir, this is just an article describing the life of Prince Louis. Jerome Bonaparte secretly changed the concept. I just made my cousin's political ideas and ideas known to the world. The wave of democracy and freedom. The thought of Nabis should not be carried silently to the grave. Your Majesty, Riyadh 1. As you can see, this has already involved politics. The editor-in-chief of the review got up and went to the desk, took out an opened pack of cigarettes from the desk, lit it with flint, and white smoke came out of the cigarette. The ignition point of the cigarette floated in the whole office, and the spicy shredded tobacco made the editor-in-chief cough twice. What if this article has been acquiesced by the government of the United Kingdom? Jerome Bonaparte said again. Cough, cough. Before the editor-in-chief could finish speaking, the spicy smell poured into the editor-in-chief's nose, causing him to cough twice. I mean, what if this article was approved by the United Kingdom government? Jerome repeated what he just said. Mr. Prince, I don't think the government would go to great lengths to deliberately censor it. The editor-in-chief of the censorship was obviously unwilling to believe it. By the way, Pessinny understood why Jerome Bonaparte was riding in the royal carriage, and he immediately said to him, Sir, I'm afraid you don't know who sent us here just now. Who? The editor-in-chief was puzzled. Mr. John Brown. Pessinny believed that as the editor-in-chief of the Times, it was impossible not to know the royal housekeeper. Ah, you guys. The editor-in-chief of the review seemed to have made up a lot of indescribable pie transactions. Sir, I advise you are not involved in politics. Jerome Bonaparte reminded. I understand. I understand. The editor-in-chief showed an understanding expression and assured Jerome Bonaparte that the article would be published on the front page of the newspaper. Jerome Bonaparte, courtesy of the editor-in-chief and Ebel, left the Times building with Pessinny. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 22. Layout creates God. Your Highness, why do we do these things? Pessinny, who left the Times building, finally couldn't help his doubts. In his opinion, isn't the most important task now to think about how to place Louis Napoleon? Jerome Bonaparte, who was walking in front, stopped and asked, Pessinny, what do you think we should do now? Of course it is to discuss a method that can properly accommodate His Majesty. The faithful Pessinny immediately blurted out. Then, how are we going to arrange for our cousin? Jerome Bonaparte asked in return. Will he be buried in London? Of course not. Pessinny shook his head and refused. When Louis Napoleon was still alive, he told Pessinny more than once that he must return to France to kiss the land of France. Now, returning to France has become Louis Napoleon's last wish, and Pessinny dared not bury Louis Napoleon's body in England. Then, what are we going to say about the cousin being transported back to France? Said Jerome Bonaparte to Pessinny. 2 months ago, the cousin was expelled from France by the leader of the Republic, Lamartine. We have no reason. I don't believe that my cousin's body will not be shut out of the country again by Lamartine. My cousin still bears the crime of a war criminal. Jerome Bonaparte, who mentioned the word war criminal, had a somewhat mocking expression on his face. War criminals? What an ironic word. The crime that Louis Philippe imposed on his cousin for the sake of his dynasty. Point in the period of the Second Republic, it still applies, whether the leader of the Republic is Lamartine or the Party of Order in the National Assembly. Point despite the sudden death of the Orleans dynasty, the soul of the Orleans dynasty still entrenched itself on the body of the Second Republic, and was ready to seize this young body for revival. Point after all, the revolutions of the 19th century were nothing more than revolutions of a handful of people. Point those guys who call themselves the elite have never once looked directly at the workers, and he contemptuously calls them inferior people. Point even those who believe in communism are no exception. Few people can regard the lower class as a truly equal existence like those two. The remnants of the 18th century hierarchy are still rippling in the 19th century. So, Pessinny still didn't understand how sending His Majesty Louis Napoleon's body back to France had anything to do with his publication in the Times. Pessigny. Jerome Bonaparte raised his head and spread his arms to bathe in the sun. I will not only bring my cousin's body back to France, but I will also make my cousin suffer like the emperor who returned 8 years ago. Welcome to the people of Paris, then. What should we do? Pessinny blurted out. Now, we are doing it. Jerome Bonaparte responded to Pessinny. Sometimes, the power of public opinion can dominate the policy of a country. We need to let our voice reach Lamartine's ears. No one knows the current situation of the French Republic better than Jerome Bonaparte. They who have gained power in a hurry not only have to face possible counterattacks from within. In fact, Louis Philippe, who lost the throne, did not want anything. The idea of counterattack, but also to face the threat of polar bears lurking behind Prussia and Austria. Point more than once, the arrogant Tsar Nicholas of St. Petersburg preached that he would lead the army to put an end to the heresy of the French Republic. Point the recognition of the United Kingdom is undoubtedly the most important thing, and the timid Lamartine will not ignore this matter. That surprised the friendly countries. That's why you have to rely on the Times. Pessinny was surprised by Jerome Bonaparte's bold plan. Point the power of public opinion is indeed very strong, but it is very likely that it will devour themselves. His Royal Highness, if the Lamartine government really wants to tear its face, wouldn't we be more passive? Pessinny asked with concern. So, we must not only use the power of the United Kingdom, but also the power within France. Jerome Bonaparte emphasized, especially the power of our followers. Pessinny. During your 8 years in France, you should have contacted a lot of people. I hope you don't let me down this time. During the 8 years Napoleon III was imprisoned in prison, when Pessinny helped Napoleon III communicate with the outside world, he attracted a large number of speculators to carry out a conspiracy to overthrow the Orleans dynasty. With the help of the internal and external forces of France, Lamartine can't tell how hard it is to eat Coptiscienses. I understand. Pessinny responded with a slight start. Once upon a time, he, referring to Pessinny, was also a master at manipulating public opinion. After years of running around for His Majesty, he almost forgot the food that he depended on to survive. It was really inappropriate. You reading www.urkanshu.com by the way, and Jerome Bonaparte suddenly thought of something and said to Pessinny, let the Bonapartists in Paris be more restrained and don't get caught in the middle of nowhere. It will take a month. France is about to undergo an earth-shaking change. Jerome Bonaparte suddenly thought that in a month's time, the brutality against the workers, led by the hardline Republican faction, will begin. The emergence of the June Revolution was definitely not a matter of 1 or 2 days. The accumulation of nearly 4 months has intensified the contradiction between the two classes to a certain extent. Jerome Bonaparte must complete all the plans before the idiot Lamartine leaves office. Otherwise, if the scoundrel of Cavaignac takes office, the plan will be difficult to implement. Sent to prison. In history, his cousin was almost suspected by Cavaignac to have a connection with the June Revolution. Some Bonapartists were indeed found in the June Revolution, and he considered sending his cousin to prison. He is not an easy character to deal with. If you don't make trouble, you will be sent to prison by this guy. Follow your orders. Although Pessinny didn't understand what Jerome was talking about, he obeyed the orders of his new boss. Let's go. Let's go back. Louis Bonaparte did not ask Pessinny how to contact the Bonapartists in France. An excellent superior only needs to know the outcome of the matter, and then reward and punish point together. The two stopped a carriage, which carried Persigny and Jerome Bonaparte back to the mansion on King St. James Street. What Jerome Bonaparte and Persigny didn't know was that an uninvited guest was also ushered in at the mansion on St. James's Street at the moment. Chapter 23, Baron Rothschild's Invitation. Just as Tyrone was sorting out the items left by Prince Louis and cleaning the clutter on the carpet, a crisp knock came from the main hall to the corridor on the second floor. After hearing the knock on the door, Tyrone handed over the cleaning to the maid and then went downstairs alone to open the door. The door of the mansion opened, and an old-fashioned, white-haired, unsmiling old man appeared at the door of Bonaparte's mansion. He was wearing a short pleated flacco dress, a bright black cotton padded vest top, and a long black bottom trousers, and a brown grey cane in his hand. "May I ask who you are?" Tyrone carefully looked at the guy in front of him. In his memory, Prince Louis' friends were either young and motivated guys, or some retired soldiers, but never an old man. Could it be that this guy is a friend of Prince Jerome? "This is Prince Louis' mansion?" the old man asked Talleyrand politely, with a butler-like position on his face and a smile. "That's right. This is Prince Louis' home." After Tyrone nodded, he added with a sad expression, "However, Prince Louis is no longer there. Now the mansion is hosted by Prince Jerome." The old man showed a regretful expression and said, "On behalf of my master, please allow me to express regret for the departure of Prince Louis. It's really a sad thing for a person as brave and upright as Prince Louis to return to the arms of God." "Yeah." Tyrone nodded quickly in agreement with the old man's statement, and asked again, "Which one is your master from Britain?" The old man's expression changed from regret to seriousness. He considered his words and said, "My master is Baron Lionel Rothschild." "Lionel Rothschild?" Tyrone's face changed greatly. He is familiar with this name. He is the actual helmsman of the Rothschild Bank branch in the United Kingdom. The Rothschild family has 3 branches in Europe, one in Britain, one in France, and one is located in Frankfurt. Is also Louis, Napoleon's #1 big creditor. After the death of his father, the former King Louis of the Netherlands, Louis Napoleon reluctantly made up for the previous shortfall after selling the estate of the old Louis, and then borrowed 600,000 francs from the Rothschild Bank in the United Kingdom with Napoleon souvenirs as a mortgage. "What's the matter with the Rothschild family? Prince Louis has left." Tyrone, who thought that the Rothschild family might come to collect debts, asked in a bad tone. The old man obviously heard the badness in Tyrone's words, but as a servant of the banker, how could he choose to shut up, because the creditor was in a bad mood? The old man continued, "My master Baron Rothschild did not, in other words, he just wants to invite Prince Jerome to visit the Baron's mansion. If His Excellency the Prince has time." Having said that, the old man took out a big red invitation letter with a Rothschild mark and gave it to Tyrone, exhorting, "Please give this to Prince Jerome." Tyrone, who received the invitation, did not read the contents, but nodded in response, "I will pass the invitation to Prince Jerome." The old man showed a satisfied smile and left in the carriage. Looking at the invitation letter in his hand, Talleyrand sighed and placed the invitation letter on the living table in the main hall. About 20 minutes later, Persigny and Jerome returned to the mansion in a carriage. Tyrone quickly got up to greet him and informed Jerome of the arrival of steward Lionel Rothschild. The Rothschilds? Jerome Bonaparte, who was leaning forward on the sofa, stared at the red invitations on the guest table. He couldn't figure out why Rothschild needed to invite him to the mansion. If it's just a simple debt collection, there is absolutely no need to invite Jerome to come over in such a big fight. The debt of 600,000 francs is really not worth the hands of Lionel Rothschild. According to the equity of later generations, the property of the Rothschild family during this period totaled more than 90 million francs. Which was only the resources that the Rothschild family could use. What bankers are best at is to use their principal as a crowbar to win over some investors of equal economic strength, or some retail investors, to increase their holdings or short the bonds of a certain country. A single Rothschild is not scary. What is scary is the allied troops united by the Rothschild family and the retail investors deposited in the Rothschild Bank. Just like the financial turmoil that saw us blow across Southeast Asia at the end of the 20th century, bankers in this period were best at taking over for the government. Point of course, the premise of this takeover is that the government can bring them enough benefits. Why? Do you think Lionel Rothschild wants to see me? Jerome Bonaparte turned to ask several Bonapartists present. You reading www.urkanshu.com. I met Prince Louis back then, the head of Rothschild. He is not a kind person. Pessinny frowned, and Lionel Rothschild was obviously not there. Pessinny expected. Why don't we refuse? Fleury suggested. It's just an invitation letter. It's on our side, whether to go or not. This is not just about an invitation letter, Fleury. You should start thinking about it. Pessinny said with a hatred of iron. Then what do you think it should be? Fleury, who was a little unhappy at the death of Louis Napoleon, retorted. Seeing that the whole room was about to be filled with the smell of gunpowder, Jerome Bonaparte hurriedly stopped the topic. He was afraid that, if he continued talking like this, the entire Bonaparte party would fall apart. Okay. Pessinny, Fleury, what we say won't help. If the other party really has bad intentions, it won't help us, no matter how much we struggle. Jerome Bonaparte spread his hands and said helplessly. After all, the situation is stronger than people. We can't resist. Of course, I believe that Baron Lionel Rothschild would not do such a thing. If he really does. Jerome Bonaparte paused for a while and said with a trace of ruthlessness in his eyes, then he will be ready to live with the Bonaparte family. I will completely eradicate this European cancer in my lifetime. Europe is not Jewish Europe. How can we allow a Jew to ride on Europa's head? 19th century Europe was still in the midst of a wave of anti-Semitism, not to mention the turbulent years of 1848. The death of a Jewish banker or two was apparently not uncommon. Chapter 24, Rothschild's Arrogance. Just when Jerome Bonaparte and others were discussing whether Baron Lionel Rothschild was a friend or an enemy, point in a 3-story mansion near Chasey Alley in West London, a middle-aged man with brown hair and a round and sturdy figure is looking down at the crowds coming and going in Chasey Alley through the carved glass of the mansion, and the corner of his mouth outlines. He smiled and said to himself, what a bunch of ignorant, fearless, and lovely people. Afterwards, he shook his head and sighed with emotion. Unfortunately, you are not the children of the times. Of course, neither am I, but I have much more than you. The middle-aged man's words carried the inherent arrogance of the rich. He closed the glass, turned around, and walked straight to the carved nanwood desk. At this time, the desk was filled with all kinds of notes, bills, and information from stock exchanges across Europe and America. Relying on this information and bills, middle-aged men can always make the right decision at the first time. Information is always the most useful thing in the 19th century, or in the 21st century. Of course, the premise of all this is whether the information has the corresponding timeliness. Once the information has passed its best effectiveness, its function and value will be greatly reduced. If the information exceeds its time limit, then it will become worthless. Thanks to the huge and convenient information management network operated by Rothschild, the timeliness of information of the Rothschild family is often known at the moment when the information itself is still spreading. That's right, the middle-aged man in front of him is Baron Lionel Rothschild, who is known as the financial ruler of the 19th century by later generations, who is at the helm of the Rothschild London branch. Lionel Rothschild, who owns 1/3 of the capital of the Rothschild Empire, had just passed his 40th birthday at this time. Lionel Rothschild looked at the bills piled up into a hill on the desk. He sat down and took out a bill from the bills inside. On the note was written Banque de France, and the amount of the note was 1,000,000 francs. This is an unmarked ticket, with which Baron Lionel Rothschild can go to the Bank of France to exchange for the same amount of gold francs. However, that was only before the revolution. After the revolution, everything changed. The provisional government began to restrict the exchange of its tokens. The panic caused by the political turmoil spread throughout Paris. The vouchers are exchanged for the equivalent gold francs. After all, God knows when the Bank of France may go bankrupt. The chaos brought about by the revolution has put the credibility of all banks in Paris at risk overnight, and even the Rothschild Bank is at risk of being run. Point in this period, the index ticket has almost become a pile of useless waste paper. Even Rothschild, who is known as turning a stone into gold, has no office in London, Paris, and Frankfurt. These three support Rothschild. The branch of the German family was severely damaged to varying degrees from 1847 to 1848. Dang. Dang dang, there was a dull knock on the door of the valuable carved Nanmu wood, pulling Lionel Rothschild, who was in deep thinking, from the realm of thinking to reality. Lionel Rothschild put down the bill, put his hands in front of the desk, and said in a low voice, "Come in." This voice was flat, indifferent, and seemed to have a magic power to master the world. The door was pushed open, and the old man in charge of delivering the message appeared in front of the study door. "Master." The old man came to salute in front of Baron Lionel Rothschild. "Yeah." Lionel Rothschild raised his eyelids slightly, and asked in a calm and indifferent tone, "What do you do with what I asked you to do, Master?" The old man replied humbly, "Prince Jerome Bonaparte is not at home. I have handed the invitation to Prince Jerome Bonaparte's entourage. Jerome Bonaparte must have. I'm very glad to receive the invitation of the master. After all, Jerome Bonaparte is only a nominal prince, and the Rothschild family you belong to is the uncrowned king of the whole of London and even the whole of Europe, the son of God." In the face of the butler's flattery, Lionel Rothschild still did not have the slightest swing mood, because he knew that the reason why the old man tried his best to flatter himself was just to find a bank for his children and grandchildren to live in as bookkeeping member. Every Rothschild family's bank clerk is selected through the Rothschild family's tests, and they will have the opportunity to learn about the inside story and management methods of a bank. If you are talented, you can also open a branch independently of Rothschild Bank. The power of finance has brought Lionel Rothschild unparalleled power, allowing him to be a guest of all countries. "Yeah, I see." Lionel Rothschild responded. www.riyadh1.com. The old man paid his respects to Lionel Rothschild again, and then closed the door, and left. Lionel Rothschild was alone in the study again. Looking at the empty study, Lionel Rothschild muttered to himself, "Jerome Bonaparte, are you like your cousin is worthy of my investment? Equals. Are you really going to go alone?" Inside the King St. James Street mansion, Persigny looked at Jerome Bonaparte, who was about to leave, and asked again, "How can I not go to the invitation of Rothschild, the uncrowned king of Europe? Besides, the Rothschild family can't delete me," Jerome Bonaparte said to Persigny half jokingly. But Persigny was a little worried that the Rothschild family would be unfavorable to Jerome Bonaparte. Jerome Bonaparte patted Persigny on the shoulder and said in relief, "Don't worry about waiting for the news of my triumph. Maybe we will have an extra generous sponsor." Persigny no longer discouraged Jerome Bonaparte. This time it was still Fleury who served as the coachman to deliver Jerome Bonaparte. Jerome Bonaparte arrived at the place mentioned in the invitation 10 minutes before 8 o'clock in the evening. It was getting late, and kerosene lamps were lit on both sides of the carriage and on the roadside. The carriage slowly pulled to the side of the road. Fleury opened the door, and Jerome Bonaparte got off. The gate of the mansion slowly opened, and the housekeeper who was in charge of delivering the letter in the morning raised a lamp and went out to greet him. "His Royal Highness, welcome to the Rothschild family." The butler hunched over to welcome Jerome's arrival. Chapter 25. Politics at the dinner table. "It's my honor to be invited by the Rothschild family." "Please don't say that." The old butler still showed a humble expression and said respectfully to Jerome Bonaparte, "The blood of the Bonaparte family will be respected by everyone wherever it goes." That man, referring to Emperor Napoleon, it made the whole of Europe tremble at that time. Jerome Bonaparte nodded non-committally and then spread his hands to express his helplessness. In today's era, the dignity of blood is far less than the power of money. What's more, people are only in awe of my uncle's strength. Bonaparte, the vast majority of the family, including me, are nothing more than a bunch of Corsican pigs tainted with my uncle's glory. The Great Revolution created us, and it also destroyed us. Yeah. Revolution, what a simple but violent term. It can make the rich become impoverished overnight, and it can also make the poor suddenly rich overnight. The old butler nodded in agreement with Jerome Bonaparte's statement. While talking, the two walked in the courtyard of the Rothschild mansion. The wide courtyard is filled with all kinds of flowers and plants. On one side of the courtyard is a rocking chair. Next to the rocking chair is a round table made of stones, and a bundle of newspapers is placed on the round table. If Jerome guessed correctly, the newspaper should be this morning. The whole courtyard looks extraordinarily quiet under the moonlight. It's hard to imagine that this is the place where the richest people in Europe live, where you don't feel the stench of money. Everything seems so natural. This unusually harmonious scene was completely changed the moment Jerome entered the main hall of the mansion. The layout of the entire main hall can be described with 4 words of grace and luxury. Carpets from Persian exotic styles are laid between the main hall and the stairs. The gilded handrails and the portraits hanging on the walls are particularly dazzling under the light of the chandeliers and candles. The blue and white porcelain from the Qing dynasty is placed in the corner of the living room. Next to the blue and white porcelain is the fireplace is decorated with exquisite weapons and oil paintings of masters. In front of the fireplace is a sofa made of cowhide. Even the cushions are also full and full. If you sit on it, you must be extremely comfortable. If you compare the Louis mansion with this, it is like a village girl in the countryside competing with a beautiful princess who is rich and beautiful. Behind every piece of graceful and luxurious decoration represent the arrogance of the Rothschild family. Jerome estimated that even the entire assets of the later President Mark could not be richer than the current Rothschild. In the whole of Europe, the only people who can suppress the Rothschild family in wealth are the royal family members of the 5 countries of Britain, France, Prussia, and Russia. They have a long history and power. They are the richest people in the whole of Europe. Please, come here. The old butler respectfully guided Jerome Bonaparte. Under the leadership of the old butler, Jerome Bonaparte crossed a long and narrow corridor to the restaurant. At the end of the corridor, the 2 servants in white velvet vests who were in charge of opening the door bowed as soon as they saw the old butler and Jerome, and the door of the restaurant was pulled open to allow only one person to pass through. Looking in through the crack of the door, the restaurant is also shrouded in gold. The long dining table is placed horizontally in the restaurant. From Jerome's point of view, Baron Lionel Rothschild cannot be seen in the restaurant. The old butler also stopped at the entrance of the restaurant and said to Jerome with the same humility, "Your Excellency, the Baron is waiting for you in the restaurant." Looking at the hallway that only accommodates one person and the splendid figure in the restaurant, Jerome's heart couldn't help but beat twice. In order to ease the tension in his heart, he opened his mouth slightly, and a wave of heat exhaled from Jerome's mouth. Following an exhalation and an inhalation, Jerome finally calmed down a little. Jerome walked into the restaurant with a good attitude. On the left side of the long dining table was a middle-aged man who seemed to be in his 40s. Jerome instantly determined that the man in front of him was Lionel Rothschild. Baron, Your Majesty, I'm sorry to invite you to be a guest at this time. I didn't encounter anything on the way. Lionel Rothschild greeted politely, and from his words Jerome Bonaparte I didn't hear much concern. It was more like a routine question of have you eaten? Thanks to you, everything is safe. Jerome Bonaparte also replied routinely. The valet in charge of the interior of the restaurant brought Jerome Bonaparte to his seat, which was on Rothschild's left. After everything was ready, the banquet officially started. The footman in charge of passing the dishes took up a plate with an aluminum lid. In the 19th century, when the aluminum industry was underdeveloped, aluminum products were a symbol of status. The 2 plates were placed before Lionel and Jerome respectively, and the aluminum cover slowly opened, and the exquisite blue and white porcelain plate came into view. Needless to say, the dinner plate must have been shipped from the Qing kingdom by sea. In the center of the dinner plate was a mass of black little pearls that were full of grains. The little pearls exuded a shocking cold air, which seemed to have been frozen. Jerome Bonaparte picked up the shiny aluminum soup spoon that was placed aside and gently scooped it into his mouth. An intoxicating burst of feeling, and the fresh and salty taste of seafood filled Jerome of the oral cavity. After a long time, Jerome reluctantly swallowed the caviar. I hope you like the sturgeon caviar from the Russian Empire. After Jerome swallowed it all, Rothschild said, I feel very sorry for your brother's departure. It's the same regret again, and it doesn't even show the expression of regret. Please, your acting skills can't be a little more realistic. Jerome silently complained in his heart, and still expressed his gratitude to Rothschild for his concern. After the first course was over, the servant took the plate back. The second dish appeared in front of Jerome. The foie gras from France was adorned with a few pieces of caviar. The whole dish was extraordinarily high-end. Jerome held the aluminum knife placed next to the dinner plate in his right hand, the steel fork in his left hand stuck on the foie gras, and the knife lightly cut a small piece into his mouth and chewed it carefully. Brother Ling once had a loan business with our Rothschild Bank. I wonder if His Excellency the Prince knows? Baron Lionel wiped the remaining sauce on the corner of his mouth with a handkerchief, looking at it. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.